I don't think that Hossenfelder has experience or qualifications to say there is no big picture, it's just a scam.
She says things about string theory that are simply aren't true.
Her description of physics and physicists is just not one that's recognizable.
If I had to guess, to your point, no, she probably doesn't really understand a lot of the nuance and a lot of the progress that we've been discussing.
I don't get the impression that she's ever gotten into the weeds about how you actually do experiments.
Sabine's approach is to just say, well, this is all nonsense and that is all nonsense, and anybody can see that this is true. It's appealing to the lowest common denominator of the everyman or every person.
Sabine, in my opinion, has become the very thing that she rails against.
From what I saw from the recent videos, it's and some posts even, it's completely indefensible.
I don't consider her even a former particle physicist.
I look at Eric Weinstein much like I look at flat earthers.
Hey everyone, you've all seen me expose Sabine Hossenfelder as a disgusting fraud peddling propaganda for fascist oligarchs, but beyond her shitty politics, it's important to understand how she lies about physics as well, and who better to help me explain that than some physicists? Let's get started. While any rational person who has watched my content on Sabine will need no further convincing that she's a lying fraud, there are still those who dismiss my content without watching it simply because I am not a physicist. So let's ruin this angle for such folks, shall we? This video will essentially be a series of interviews with working physicists who are well equipped to explain how Sabine's claims regarding specific physics concepts and the status of the field in general are completely erroneous. They will range from industrious postdocs with a gift for science communication, all the way to highly prominent senior researchers that I personally reached out to and were gracious enough to lend some commentary. As I've said a few times recently, the willingness among the scientific community to collaborate with science communicators like myself is increasing, and I couldn't be more thrilled about it. We are finally coming together to neutralize this vile propaganda spewed at the behest of Peter Thiel and other oligarchs, which is aimed at polarizing the public against the scientific community, and I feel the tide beginning to shift in terms of public perception as more people are waking up to the fact that they've been bamboozled. But you've heard me deconstruct this grift in extreme detail in my last video on Sabine, so let's jump straight to the interviews. Once again, we will be hearing from some heavy hitters in this video, but let's first begin with a familiar face. That would be Christian Ferko, who so masterfully demolished Eric Weinstein's geometric unity in a previous video. In my last video on Sabine, there was a brief section where she made some highly technical comments regarding string theory and related topics. I made a few comments in response, but noted that it would be best to come back to that section with an expert, and that's Christian. Let's see what he has to say. Christian, thanks so much for joining me again. Today we have something very specific to do. Given our previous conversation about geometric unity, Sabine came to Eric's defense, and there's a very specific section of that video where she rattles off a lot of technical jargon and makes some specific accusations towards the physics community. And we need you here to dissect what she said for us, please.
Yeah, I'd be happy to go through it. The whole video was kind of a train wreck, even the beginning part, which I won't even mention in the slides. She kind of sane washes geometric unity in a way which I think is slightly dishonest. She kind of focuses on the parts that sound closest to what might be considered reasonable by mainstream physicists. Mm-hmm. So it's a big mess, but I have some slides. Let's see if I can screen share. All right, so let me just jump right in. So we've been talking about this video that Sabine put out recently defending Eric, and the main claims of this video are that what Eric does in GU is basically similar to mainstream theoretical physics. She says it's in line with the nonsense these guys are doing. Sean knows that everything his colleagues do is sort of flaky stuff. And I'm going to criticize the technical claims that she makes, but just to be totally clear up front, so that don't get the wrong impression, I'm not saying that Sabine is a crackpot. She's done some real work, and I'm not criticizing her scientific credentials, but I agree with the things that Dave has said, that what she is saying is sort of disingenuous and the rhetoric is a bit irresponsible, especially claiming that most research funded by taxes is bullshit. So I'd like to break down what she says and maybe push back a little bit on the claim that most of this research is bullshit by highlighting some of the work that my friends and colleagues are doing, which I think is actually really good and deserves more attention. Okay, so let's do this first part. So the first thing she says is about ADS-CFT. So the first comment is about this part of string theory. We have different words for this, either holography, ADS-CFT, or gauge gravity duality. And she says at this timestamp,
well, Joel, why don't you talk for a little bit about all these supposed ADS-CFT predictions for condensed matter, this or that, which were supposed to revolutionize superconductivity? Whatever happened to that?
And Dave spoke about this a little bit, but let me just review for those that don't know, what is this ADS-CFT that she's talking about? And I'll quote from a popular science book. I just highlighted a couple of the words here to explain a little bit what holography is. But this author says, research on string theory has brought about what they describe as the biggest breakthrough in foundational physics in the last decades, this gauge-gravity duality, which is a relationship between seemingly different theories. On the one hand, there's a gravity theory, and on the other hand, there's a quantum field theory or a gauge theory, and they turn out to be equivalent, which lets us do some calculations that we normally can't do otherwise. And this author goes on to say that the implications of this duality are nothing but astonishing, says all of these nice things about it, and then comes to the point that Sabine was just raising about superconductivity. This author points out that string theorists have used this tool, this holography, to understand the quark-gluon plasma, which Dave has explained, and also high-temperature superconductors, and that the qualitative results are promising. I have a small quibble that this author says there's no quantitative results yet, and as Dave explained, there were numbers that were computed for this quark-gluon plasma story, and those are quantitative, but most of what this author says about holography is correct. It is nothing but astonishing, it's a big breakthrough, and there's promising qualitative results. Now, we understand media literacy, so when I show you something like this, you're probably wondering, okay, Christian, who wrote this? Are you feeding me from some string propaganda from someone who's pushing an agenda? And I'll tell you, the author who wrote this is named Sabine Hossenfelder. This comes from her own book, Lost in Math, where she's giving the pros and cons of string theory. And the quote that I just showed you comes from the part where she describes the pros. So it's a little out of context, but the cons section does not discuss holography and superconductivity at all. So it's not really relevant for this discussion. And she even says in the book that both the pro story and the con story are true. So taken at face value, she at least believes that this high temperature superconductivity stuff that holography is helping us do is promising. So she claims. Okay, so what is the specific application to superconductivity that she's talking about? Well, we already mentioned the quark-gluon plasma stuff that sort of kicked off some of this direction, but she seems to be complaining about this specific paper, following up on some work of Gupser that was related, about building a superconductor with ADS-CFT, which was by Sean Hartnell, Chris Herzog, and Gary Horowitz. And it seems that her objection is that what the people did in this paper was somehow not revolutionary enough. It didn't revolutionize superconductivity. So let me just briefly tell you what these guys actually did. I think it's a beautiful paper that more people should know about. It has 1,735 citations. Lots of people are excited about this. And roughly what they do is to use this fact. I just told you that holography tells us that some quantum field theories are equivalent to some gravity theories, which is cool. It turns out that superconductivity, which is this fact that when you cool down certain materials below some temperature, they hit a point where they have zero electrical resistance. A current will just persist forever below this temperature. And superconductivity can be understood in terms of certain field theories, quantum field theories like this BCS theory. So what these authors do is to say, well, okay, that's a quantum field theory. Let's cook up a gravity scenario, which has a black hole. This black hole plays the role of the temperature in the temperature of the superconductor. And that gravity theory is equivalent to a certain field theory, which is similar. It shares some properties with the one that describes superconductivity. And then they do a gravity calculation where they show that when you cool down this system, where the temperature again comes from the black hole, below a certain temperature, you hit a phase transition where something called this charged scalar condenses. And that's the signal that there's a superconducting phase transition. So the electrical resistance indeed goes to zero. It's a way of understanding superconductivity using gravity, which is very, very exciting. So I think that's cool, but I should tell you that this is a toy model. When we take Physics 101, you do a lot of things with frictionless pulleys and no air resistance, throwing a projectile with zero friction and things like this.
Yeah,
so,
ideal environments, yeah.
Yeah, we do this all the time. And physicists are sometimes made fun of and say, okay, well, it's like a spherical cow in a vacuum or something like this. But this approximation is still useful, I should say. And if I understand Sabine's objection correctly, she seems to be complaining that even though this was idealized, it was a toy model, it did not lead to a real world high temperature superconductor, which is sort of the holy grail of the field, something that people are really trying to find. So I think this is a bit unfair. And if you'll permit me a slightly hyperbolic analogy, I'm not saying that holography is as revolutionary as Newtonian mechanics, but to me, this seems a little bit like if Newton came to you and said, hey, I understand that gravity, the same force that makes apples fall out of trees, also explains the motion of heavenly bodies like planets. And I can solve in some approximation, I can solve for the motion of the Earth around the sun. And it's as though Sabine says, okay, but did you build a rocket and put a man on Mars, do some real world application of this? It sounds like flaky stuff. It's a theoretical insight that gives us really remarkable conceptual power, which has earned some serious praise. So to summarize this part, I think this comparison of the holographic superconductors as flaky stuff compared to GU is really a false equivalence. I mean, holography is well defined by our physics standards. GU is not. Holography is useful for all sorts of things. GU, as far as I can tell, has no uses. And holography has passed many consistency checks where GU has not. And I think even worse, I think what she's doing with this criticism is kind of moving the goalposts a little bit, where she first says, what theorists do is nonsense. And then it's as though we say, well, it's not nonsense. Holography is giving us useful insights into various other areas. But then she sort of steps back and says, well, the criteria for success is now you have to revolutionize superconductivity. You have to give me a high temperature superconductor. And okay, well, that's much harder, but I thought you were just telling us that what we were doing is nonsense. So I find this disingenuous. I think it's not a very fair criticism.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like origin of life researchers saying if you can't put a few molecules into some reaction vessel and get a fully functional cell, then we're clueless about origin of life. Yeah.
Right. It's too much. I mean, you have to. There's levels of understanding of things.
Yeah.
So that I think we can kind of dismiss that criticism. I'd like to move on to her comments about how string theory is defined, which Dave also spoke about a bit before. She seems to be comparing geometric unity, which has ill-defined operators like this ship in a bottle that we spoke about, and say that, well, that's kind of as bad as string theory because she says...
And just exactly how is string theory defined anyway? Did they actually ever solve the problem of quantum gravity? Like, did they ever prove it's finite?
Now, if we're being charitable, Sabine might be talking about some issues with the so-called non-perturbative definition of string theory, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I'd like to just tell you the basic definition in a bit more detail, because I think it's very simple and quite beautiful. It's something that I think everyone can appreciate. So in physics, we often define our theories by something called a Lagrangian, or if you know calculus, the integral of the Lagrangian is called an action. And we spoke about this a little bit in the context of geometric unity. And for a particle, which is completely well understood, the action for a particle, this world line action, where a particle traces out this line in time as it moves around, the action is pretty simple to write down, and it's just the length of this world line. So it's this s is minus the mass of the particle, the speed of light, and this integral that gives you the length of the world line. It's pretty simple. So you might ask, how do you define the action for a string? And the natural guess is to say, well, if for a particle you take the length of this world line, for a string, maybe you should take the area of this thing, this world sheet that it sweeps out as it moves through time. And that's exactly right. So we define string theory, even in undergraduate courses, by this thing called the Nambu-Goto action, which I've written here. The details aren't super important, but all you really need to know is that this is just computing the area of this world sheet that's swept out by the string. So you can just think of it as taking this string that sweeps out some world sheet. We use these letters tau and sigma for the x and y axes. We chop up this world sheet into little squares, and then we add up the areas of all of those squares with an integral weighted by this thing that tells you how much that area should count for. It's nothing complicated. It's not rocket science. It's just an area, and this defines string theory. Okay. The remarkable thing, coming now to this question of did these guys solve the problem of quantum gravity, the remarkable thing is that if you write down that theory, just the area of the world sheet swept out by a fundamental string, and you just put in two inputs, you demand consistency with Einstein's theory of special relativity, which, remember, has no gravity. Special relativity is basically just saying nothing can go faster than the speed of light. And you demand compatibility with quantum mechanics. then as a logical consequence, what comes out is Einstein's theory of general relativity, gravity. It comes out for free. And this is quite amazing. I'm quoting here from David Tong's string theory lecture notes, which I highly recommend. He says something rather remarkable has happened here. We started out by looking at how a single string moves in flat space, and on the grounds of consistency alone, we're led to this action governing space-time, which is gravity, and other fields. It feels like the tail has wagged the dog, right? You just put in this tiny string, and you get gravity out for free. And this is why people are very excited about string theory. I mean, when I first saw this as an undergraduate, I was reminded of a quote by Sal Khan, who said, "If this does not blow your mind, then you have no soul." It's such a beautiful result, which is why people are excited about string theory as a theory of quantum gravity. Now, about this finiteness, so I think I've tried to argue that string theory combines quantum mechanics and gravity in a consistent framework. Sabine has asked whether it was proven to be finite, and I would say the answer is yes. Years ago, people would say, we don't have a complete proof, but we have checked many, many cases. So you can do many different calculations and check whether the theory is finite in all of those cases. And there was overwhelming evidence that string theory was finite based on all of the cases that were checked. But more recently, there's also been work in this field called string field theory, this new area, which you can think of as string theory on steroids. It's a souped up version of string theory. And if you're interested, there's this nice review by Ashok Sen and Barton Zvibach from last year. And you can just go to this section on UV finiteness, where they explain to you how to prove finiteness of string theory. And at the beginning of that section, they're even a bit apologetic, where they almost seem to be apologizing for proving this to you, because they say, yeah, we already know the theory is finite. People have known this for a long time. But let's give you a different way to understand why the theory is finite. And they go through an argument. I've skipped the details here for time, but you can check the review if you like. But at the end of that section, they essentially conclude that there are no UV divergences, none of these infinities that appear in the theory. So by the standards of proof that we have in string theory, this essentially constitutes a proof of finiteness. It's not a mathematical proof. As Dave said last time, even the standard model cannot be defined in a way that is so rigorous that it would satisfy a mathematician. But by the standards of physics, yes, this is a proof of finiteness of string theory. Okay, so what about this other non-perturbative stuff that I mentioned? And here I just want to briefly give some praise to some people who are working on very hard problems. I think Sabine is right that there are some features of string theory that are still not understood, but fortunately, there are people much smarter than me who are working on these problems. And I just want to highlight one from my colleague, Rafael Alvarez Garcia, from his PhD thesis, which I encourage you to look up. You can Google this. And the first section of this gives an overview of what we've learned about string theory from a very recent perspective that I think is readable even to non-experts. And he focuses on some of these non-perturbative issues that Sabine might be talking about if we're being charitable. And just to quote him a little bit to see where are we, he begins by saying, well, any realistic theory of nature has to make contact with experiment. He talks about the progress in string theory doing this. He says there are obstacles that come from our ignorance of some of these underlying principles of the theory, these issues with non-perturbative definitions. But then he says, despite our ignorance being only relative, because in absolute terms, a tremendous amount has been learned about string theory in the past decades, it's reasonable to humbly take a step back and try to understand these thorny non-perturbative issues more deeply. So I think Rafa is being very humble and very eloquent here, the way that he's talking about it. I think to be fair, we know a huge amount about string theory. The definition is good enough to do all sorts of stuff. But people who are thinking about this nowadays are trying to now use more modern techniques in order to understand some of these issues that are still not completely understood. And one of these is this swampland program that Rafa works on. And a lot of people are thinking about this in the string theory community nowadays, this swampland program, which connects a little bit to what Sabine is objecting to. So just for maybe a minute, maybe I'll tell you a little bit about this because I think it's very cool and it's an example of science which is not bullshit, as Sabine says. So what these guys are doing in this swampland program is just to ask, what must be true about any low energy theory that comes from some theory of quantum gravity, like string theory, at high energies? So energy is vertical here. At high energies, we have some theory of everything, a quantum gravity theory or a string theory. And at low energies, there's some approximation to that theory. And these guys want to ask, what can we learn about the low energy theory? What must be true? What constraints are there that emerge simply because the theory must have come from a quantum gravity theory at high energies? It's a very natural question.
So high energy, low energy, high energy, we're talking about like early universe, exceptionally high temperature, right?
Yes, something like that.
Either forces are unified, and then low energy, we're talking about all around us, like what we see.
That's exactly right. So it's like the diagram that you had in the last video about in the early universe, all of these forces are unified. The four fundamental forces are all together. That's the high energy regime. And we don't know how to probe that directly. We don't have particle accelerators that can go to energies which
like
are that
high energy. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. We can do like electroweak stuff, but we can't get all the way back to that unified state.
Yes, that's exactly right. So it's kind of natural to ask, since we can't probe that directly, can we learn something indirectly just by assuming there's a consistent unification and then ask what else must be true if that is the case?
What would be true of what we can see around us if this were the case? Yeah.
Yeah. And these guys are doing really fantastic work on this. So essentially what they do is they formulate these hypotheses. They call them conjectures, these swampland conjectures. And there's a few of them. One of them is this weak gravity conjecture, which basically says that in any consistent theory, gravity must be the weakest force. That's of course true in our worlds. Gravity is the weakest force because I can pick up a pen using just the electromagnetic repulsion of my hand and fight the entire gravity of the Earth. But the conjecture is that that must be true in any theory of quantum gravity. There's another one called this distance conjecture, which you can think of as though if you have a map of all of the possible theories of quantum gravity, and you have a little knob that you can turn, like a dial that moves you around the map, the distance conjecture is just saying that if you turn that dial by a little bit, then the ingredients in your theory of quantum gravity don't change by too much. They stay roughly the same. But if you turn the dial too far, so you move very far on the map, then lots of new ingredients come in that you have to take into account in order for the theory to stay consistent. That's just a rough explanation of this conjecture. And being good scientists, what these people do is test these conjectures and study their implications. And I've just shown one paper by Rafa and collaborators that is looking at one of these conjectures, this distance conjecture, and testing it in a particular case and studying implications, these consistency conditions that are implied by this conjecture. And this is just good science. You have to be honest, you test things, and you ask what they imply. So I say this just to say, here is an example of science which is not bullshit and which is addressing some of these remaining issues about non-perturbative features of string theory that is continuing to improve our understanding of the definition of this theory. So to conclude just this part, I think this criticism B, the second one, about the definition of string theory is kind of disingenuous. String theory is well defined, it's finite, and it's a theory of quantum gravity. You could do this Mott and Bailey sort of thing and push back and say, well, what about non-perturbative aspects? And there's ongoing research on that, which is very interesting. But again, as Dave said, even the standard model is not fully understood at a non-perturbative or mathematically rigorous level. So to demand this of string theory is a double standard. And to compare this to GU, we've explained in great detail that GU is not well defined, and I've argued it can't give rise to a consistent quantum theory for several reasons. So comparing these, I think, is at best a double standard, and at worst, it may even be intentionally deceptive.
Maybe.
Maybe. I'm being perhaps charitable, but so what about this third part? So there's some technical jargon she launches into about this Calabi-Yau stuff. So she says at this timestamp,
what Calabi-Yau manifold are we talking about again?
And I think this very brief comment is meant to cast some shade and aspersions, to use Eric's terminology, on a part of string theory called the landscape, which we saw briefly in this swampland picture. But let me just try to give you a little context for what this is about. So there's many areas and subfields of string theory. This one is a criticism of something called string phenomenology. And there was a great conference that I went to at Northeastern just a couple of weeks ago in July with a lot of very smart people who are thinking about these questions. And roughly what these guys are trying to do is to use the toolkit of string theory, which has a lot of ingredients like Legos that you can put together in different ways to build different theories. And they're trying to combine those ingredients to build realistic models. So they want to make contact with actual physics in our universe, like particle physics and cosmology. And one of the central topics in the subject, the string phenomenology, is studying string compactifications. That's where this Calabi-Yau comes in. So what is a compactification? There's this consistency condition when we study superstring theory that tells us that the superstring must live in 10 space-time dimensions. So that's 9 space and 1 time, but we only see 4 of those. We see 3 space and 1 time dimension. So compactification is this procedure of curling up those 6 extra dimensions that we don't see. You put them into some tiny hidden space that is so small that we can't observe it at the current energy levels. And a common choice for what space you use, what shape do you pick for that 6-dimensional space, is something called a Calabi-Yau manifold, named after these 2 guys, Calabi and Yau. Now, the issue, as Sabine sees it, I think, is that there are many Calabi-Yaus and many choices to make in compactification. And this leads to this so-called landscape of options. So there's a lot of different choices, and depending on which choices you make, you get different physics in the remaining 4 dimensions, so the dimensions that we see. And Sabine's main criticism is, well, there's so many choices, and we don't currently know which of those choices, which compactification of string theory, gives rise to the universe that we currently live in. Now, I think that's true, and there's challenges, but it's a little unfair to say that we don't really know anything about this. We've learned a lot, and I'll refer people to this very nice review from just last year by Fernando Marchesano, Gary Shu, and Timo Weigand. And they summarize what we have learned about how to get real physics out of string theory, like the standard model. And at the end, when they summarize, they say, yes, the standard model can be embedded into string theory. The main ingredients of the standard model follow relatively naturally from the principles of string theory. The remaining issues are reproducing exactly the standard model and getting all of these details right. And they do say this is more involved. But each of those properties that you might try to get in the standard model, they say, either has been obtained or is within reach. So I think we're getting very close. It's an active area of research, but we're making more and more progress about recovering realistic physics from string compactifications and string phenomenology. And just to highlight one very recent piece of work, which I think is very impressive, and it's pushing us closer and closer towards this goal. This is work by these 5 guys whose names will be on the next slide. One of them, Thomas Harvey, is one of my colleagues at IFI in the same collaboration as me. And they've been doing fantastic work using artificial intelligence tools like neural networks to get real numerical data, actual predictions. You pick a string theory compactification, and they get numbers out. This paper is called Computation of Quark Masses from String Theory. And just to briefly flash what they're doing, here's the abstract and here's the names of the authors. But the TLDR is that these guys set up a neural network. So they're using AI. You put it on a computer, and you pick one of these choices in compactifying string theory, and then you just compute. If you use that compactification, what do you get? And they can actually compute masses of particles like quarks. They compute quark masses, which are real physical things. They make plots. You don't see any plots, of course, in the GU paper, but there's real numerical things where you can look at them, and then you can start to ask, do these numerical predictions agree with the masses of quarks that we see? And if not, you can try to move around and pick different compactifications that give more accurate predictions in order to make contact with our world.
We have reliable values for quark masses, or do we only have boundaries?
I think we have pretty reliable numbers for masses of quarks. There's a bit of a subtlety because bound states like the proton and neutron, a lot of the mass comes not from the quarks themselves, but from gluons that are binding them. But we have reasonably good understanding of how quarks behave, what the masses should be. So this is real science. These guys compute numbers and they make plots. And I think comparing string phenomenology to geometric unity, which has no numerics, no dynamical features. It's kind of an irresponsible false equivalence that Sabine is engaging in here. Okay, and the last part, there's this segment right at the end of Sabine's little rant when she talks about a different area, something called loop quantum gravity. So she says at the end, seeming to compare this lack of a well-defined Lagrangian in GU, partially due to this undefined Cheab operator, to some other difficulties in this other theory, loop quantum gravity, where there are issues in finding a well-defined Hamiltonian, which is something a bit like a Lagrangian. So she asks,
or how about loop quantum gravity? Do they have a well-defined Hamiltonian? Where is the classical limit?
So here I partly agree. I agree with Sabine that there are serious problems with loop quantum gravity that have not yet been overcome, which is why personally I don't work on it, and few people work on it nowadays compared to other areas like string theory. And the two criticisms that she leveled are essentially correct, that loop quantum gravity, it does have what's called a well-defined kinematical Hilbert space, but they have not yet realized the Hamiltonian constraint in an anomaly-free way. And they don't yet know how to take the classical limit in order to recover conventional gravity. But although these are problems that need to be overcome, I claim these issues are not as severe as those with geometric unity. These have a chance of being overcome, and people are working on them. A second observation is that the goals are different. The level of claims and the burden of proof are different in GU and loop quantum gravity, since GU claims to be a theory of everything. Loop quantum gravity does not. They just want to quantize gravity, but not unify it with the other fundamental forces. And there's one other major difference I want to point out, which is the reaction to criticism between loop quantum gravity and Eric in his theory of GU. So a very brief story related to loop quantum gravity concerns this Kodama state. So in 2002, Lee Smolin, who's a very serious guy, who's one of the originators of loop quantum gravity, proposed this particular state, this thing called a Kodama state, as a candidate ground state in loop quantum gravity. And Edward Witten, who we discussed before, put out a response paper that highlighted some issues with the state. So I've just flashed the paper here. He productively pointed out some things that are not correct about this Kodama state. And the loop quantum gravity community responded. They engaged with this criticism. And for instance, Andrew Rondono wrote 2 papers trying to address them. So he generalized the Kodama state in response to this productive scientific criticism from Ed. I just want to contrast this with what has happened with geometric unity, since we've discussed Tim and Theo Polia's paper, which critiques GU. And as far as I can tell, Eric has not directly engaged with Tim and Theo at any point about their criticism of his work. The closest thing I could find was this Clubhouse discussion, which some of your viewers might be familiar with.
Yeah, I highlighted this whole thing.
Okay, so you've seen this before, but for completeness, when he was asked, when will we hear a debate with Eric and Theo and Timothy about GU, he goes on this long rant where he repeatedly points out that one of the authors is anonymous and asks, who is Theo Polia? He says, I'm fucking sick of these 2 people. He accuses them of all of these things, which I've seen no evidence for. He starts deflecting and speaking about rape jokes and all of this kind of gross stuff, which is unscientific and has nothing to do with the criticism. And then
I have to go walk my dog.
Yes, there is that part as well. He leaves the conversation because he says, I need to walk my dog now or something in order to escape. And the only other comment that I could find was on Twitter. At some point, Eric responded to something that Timothy Nguyen said and just said, boom, look at the itty bitty balls on little Timmy. And I don't really know what to say about that, so maybe I'll just present it without comment.
Yeah, this is all in my first video on both of the Weinstein brothers. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so this has already been covered.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just wrap up here again, a high-level summary of what is going on in this Sabine video. So from my perspective, here is the big picture. So Eric's work, as we've already said multiple times, is undeserving of scientific attention, and he has been justifiably criticized, both for the science and for behavior like what we've just seen and what Dave has reviewed before. Sabine attempts to sane wash geometric unity by falsely arguing that it's comparable to other things that people are doing in theoretical physics. And then she makes a series of technical comments that we've now gone through one by one that suggest that these other research directions are somehow as bad or as flaky as geometric unity. And I think all of these are fallacious. They're either flat out wrong, maybe misleading or misrepresentations or false equivalences. And overall, I think they're scientifically untenable. So at the end of the day, I would disregard this defense of Eric that Sabine has mounted. And I think the real story here is that the actual scientists who are doing serious, honest work, like some of the people that I've highlighted in this little mini talk, those are the ones who I think should be deserving of more of this attention, not Eric's geometric unity.
Yeah, you cannot conclude anything but that she's being disingenuous here. I mean, not that most of us know anything about string theory, and even after all of this, I wouldn't say I know a whole lot about string theory, but it's pretty undeniable to look at what you're saying and conclude that there is rigor. There are very clear objectives. These objectives are being, researched, and there's follow through. There's quantifiable predictions. Yeah, it's absolutely insane to compare anything that's going on in the legitimate physics community with GU. So, yeah.
Yes, it's a night and day comparison. So hopefully you've made it clear to the viewers now in increasing level of clarity in multiple videos that this is the case. But I'm hoping this will be the final nail in the coffin, and we can finally stop paying attention to GU and acknowledge the real scientists for the hard work they're doing.
Yes. So given that we talked quite a lot about Eric in a previous video, and now a bit more here in comparing GU to real physics, with Sabine, do you get the sense that she even has the capacity to comprehend these areas of science, or what's your perspective on her?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting since I've looked at some of her papers and her publication history. As I said at the beginning, she's a serious scientist, so there are certainly many aspects of modern theoretical physics that she does understand. But if I had to guess, I think that she hasn't really kept up with developments in the field, since I think many of her criticisms are things that have been leveled against string theory for decades now. You could go back to the early 2000s and see the criticisms that people were making about string theory at that time. And there's been enormous progress since then, as we've now reviewed. And not really any of that, as far as I can tell, features in Sabine's commentary on it. So if I had to guess, to your point, no, she probably doesn't really understand a lot of the nuance and a lot of the progress that we've been discussing. And she's taking a sort of old-fashioned view where she wants to be very pessimistic and say no one is making any progress, everything is crap. And I think that's just doing a disservice to real scientists.
Why update the script even one iota when it works just fine for brainwashing people? It's like, it reminds me of apologists talking about how origin of life research hasn't progressed since the Miller-Urey experiment of the 1960s or whenever it was. It's just so unbelievably disingenuous. Who can take this seriously?
Yes, it's just wrong, but sadly, a lot of people don't know better. And hopefully now some of them will learn.
Yes, hopefully. Yeah. I mean, I think, I've said all that I can say. Well, not all I can say, but I've said quite a bit on Sabine at this point. But I think that now this is the point where passing it along to you guys, the members of the physics community, people need to hear what you have to say. So definitely appreciate your continued engagement with this.
Great. Yes, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me back on. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, good luck with fighting the good fight.
Thanks, Christian. Something tells me you'll be seeing more of him on my channel, but I do hope he does a lot more science communication on his own as well, because he's knocking it out of the park. Speaking of good SciComm, let's talk to another such figure. Sam Gregson is a PhD particle physicist from Cambridge who worked at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, and he also does SciComm through his YouTube channel, Bad Boy of Science. Given that Sabine is always crapping on particle accelerators, I think we should get a more informed perspective. Let's talk to Sam.
Sam, thanks so much for joining me here. I want to talk to you a little bit about particle accelerators, because Sabine is always railing on particle accelerators. They're such a ridiculous waste of money. You work with particle accelerators. Let's get down to the bottom of this. Let's get some counterpoint about this.
Yeah, and I think a big problem with Sabine's output is that you don't see that counterpoint. there's a hell of a lot of kind of preaching, proselytizing. I am the only honest John in the room, and the scientists who are looking to build these machines don't really have any good reason for doing what they're doing, and this is a real problem with our output as I see it. So, I mean, why are we looking to build a bigger particle collider is maybe the question that's on most people's lips. And this would be the Future Circular Collider, particularly the first part, the first phase, which would be the Future Circular Collider EE. Now, this would be a Higgs factory. So we've discovered the Higgs boson at the LHC. We now know the mass of the Higgs boson, and therefore we can now build a new machine that will go and produce a hell of a lot of these things. That means we can zoom in on them, we can put them under the microscope, we can study them with incredibly high statistics. And this is essentially what we did back in the 1970s, 80s, when the W and Z were discovered. I think in the 80s, if I'm right in saying, we then built the Large Electron Positron Collider, a lepton collider, to put them under the microscope, the W and Z. And we're looking to do something very similar with the Higgs here. So what I find with Sabine's output is she'll very much focus on the idea that we're building these machines to look for crazy things that have been made up in the minds of theorists. So, supersymmetry. She talks a lot about ghost particles, dark matter, extra dimensions, things that have not shown up. And that's not really the major use case for this new collider, at least not in the first phase. That major goal is to put the Higgs under the microscope. Now, you might ask, why would we want to do that? This is going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to build a hell of a big tunnel. Why would we want to build this machine? Well, the Higgs is an incredibly unique particle. It's the only scalar particle, the only particle with no spin, which is in the Standard Model. So it's the only seemingly fundamental scalar particle we have. If you look at that picture of the Standard Model, it's kind of off in the corner by itself. Very, very unique, very, very different. And it's also linked to 15 of the 19 free parameters that we put into the Standard Model. So it's at the center of the Standard Model and linked to an incredible number of problems within the Standard Model. 15 of 19 free parameters. So if you want to be going to look for discrepancies with the Standard Model, you want to look for inconsistency of the Standard Model, naively, looking at the Higgs is an incredibly important place to look, and an incredibly target-rich environment for looking for those inconsistencies. People will say, look, the Standard Model has been verified, we found all the pieces, but there are a hell of a lot of things we still don't know about the Higgs boson. We don't know how it couples to some of the lighter particles, for example. We don't know its intrinsic width, which is an incredibly important measurement that we'd like to make at the FCCEE. So some of your viewers might be aware that when we built the Large Electron Positron Collider, we looked for the width of the Z boson. And what that allowed us to do was look for the decay rate of the Z boson and check that we'd found all of the things that Z boson couples to and decays into. And we'd like to do a similar thing with the Higgs boson. We'd like to work out its decay rate at the FCCEE, and then we can make sure that we have a full inventory of everything that the Higgs interacts with. So we're not necessarily looking for specific decay modes of crazy particles that have been made up. We're looking to make sure that we have a full inventory of everything the Higgs is decaying into. And that gives us a hell of a lot of ground to cover, and it's a very important measurement to make without us looking for any particular decay mode in particular.
I mean, the idea is by putting the Higgs under the microscope, as you say, we're fleshing out the Standard Model, right? I mean, the idea is that ideally some unexpected results may crop up and maybe some exotic particles could be confirmed, but we're working on the Standard Model, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I actually find it very unhelpful when people say that the Standard Model's complete, we found the Higgs, everyone can go home, this is all sorted. There's a hell of a lot of things we don't know about the Standard Model. We don't know if it couples to the lighter particles in the way that we think it does. Like I say, we don't know its intrinsic width. We don't even know the shape of the Higgs potential. So we don't know exactly why and how particles acquire their mass. These are things that we need to measure at future colliders. And I find it a little bit frustrating. There's a line that Sabine had on Twitter a few months back. And she knows this. She knows this major reason of putting the Higgs under the microscope for a new collider. And she said, the most important purpose for such a mega collider will be to study the Higgs boson in more detail and measure some other particle properties more precisely. But then she goes on to say, It's not entirely uninteresting, but as I said previously, I think it's too expensive for something with so little use. But this is without explaining just how important that Higgs boson is and how it's linked to these 15 out of 19 free parameters. It's at the center of that standard model for a reason, because it's spinless and because it has these potential interactions with.
But then even further, right? She's admitting the purpose of this, but then in later rhetoric, it's just it's pointless. It's a waste of money.
Exactly.
I mean, and look, it is a lot of money, but can't we point to a lot of different public projects that cost that amount of money? Like, it's not, it's a lot of money, but sometimes we build expensive things, right? I mean,
she would say this is the money wasted otherwhere problem, that you're saying, oh, other things are not worth the money. I think the problem here is that she very much focuses, and this is another place where I think she misrepresents the financial case for new machines, doesn't put the other side, because she will focus on these big upfront numbers, 15 billion, and this kind of libertarian porn that billionaires would step in and build this thing if it was worth a damn. Now, $15 billion is a large amount of money, and it's a large amount of money, particularly in science budgets, which are, as you will know, in the US in particular, shrinking. However, what she fails to know is that these machines have massive positive returns on investment, according to all studies that are out there. So if you're going to put the number 15 billion, but you're not going to talk about the return on investment, or you're going to say, I don't think the return investment will be realized, then you're being incredibly intellectually dishonest. If I say to you, Dave, you're going to gamble on a horse or something, you're going to want to know the odds. What am I going to get back? What are the winnings going to be if that pays off? If you're just cutting off one of those sides and saying, I don't think that'll happen, then you're really misinforming the audience. You have to talk about that return on investment. If you look at the relative or the relevant kind of future circular collider media kits, you'll see that the machine costs about the cost of a cup of coffee for every EU taxpayer. So, that's not insignificant, and you can argue that the money should go elsewhere. But you can't argue that this is a massive amount of money. It's noise on government budgets, which was something that was made, in the grand scheme of things. And that was something that was kind of made clear to her. Really, this is an issue of where we want to spend our money, right? Where do we want to spend our money? As you say, there are things that are incredibly expensive. Do we want to spend our money on this? Well, I would argue it's something that has a projected massive return on investment.
Right.
It's a project which is in a type of project which has a very good historical record of producing a lot of value for the public. So we talk about the World Wide Web, we can talk about touchscreens, we can talk about proton therapy, we can talk about medical imaging, we can talk about all these things.
Yeah, I guess.
But if you're going to cut off that side and only talk about 15 billion, then you're really doing the audience a disservice.
Isn't the point, correct me if I'm wrong, that in doing this work, we build a more fundamental understanding of the basic constituents of the universe, and we can use that to build better computers and do all these kinds of technological advancements? And isn't that precisely why the private sector isn't going to invest in this? Because you can't patent a fundamental understanding of what particles are made of or something like that. That's an investment that is then going to be exported, right? The global scientific community can then utilize that information to build technology. So there's no incentive for the private sector to do that. That's why it's a public work.
You made this point very well in a previous video. It's all well and good saying, the private sector could do this, but then where are the benefits going to go? Yeah. Right? It goes into Elon Musk's pocket because he's selling some new piece of kit for medical or whatever.
Yeah,
maybe that feeds through
the next particle that's discovered. The next Higgs boson or whatever it is. You can't patent that. So
exactly. So if you're talking about blue sky research of discovering something, maybe that doesn't have an immediate application. A lot of people will say the Higgs boson incredibly short-lived. Are we going to be able to make new computers with it? Probably not. Are we going to be able to make anti-gravity boots with it? No. So who's going to pay for that? This is a decision about what we want to spend money on as democratic nations.
Well, right. And it's just that fundamental understanding of physics allows us to discern new applications like superconductivity and things like that, right? We wouldn't have that if we didn't probe on the smallest fundamental scales, and we need these instruments to do that, to understand how the universe works, essentially, right?
Most definitely. I find, to a certain extent, this trying to tie everything to must have an immediate sort of monetary return, you know, a
Very
bit of a
short
fool's
sighted.
errand. Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very short-sighted. I mean, people will talk about, you know, the discovery of the electron at the turn of the previous century.
I use
Who
that
knew
example
that
all the time.
nowadays that's, you know, in my phone, in
Right.
my computer, in every computer that we're using, in every interactive device that we're using.
And I would love to go back to 1897 and hear Joe Schmo with the newspaper go, why do I care about this electron? What is this? You know, yeah.
This crazy Cambridge physicist firing things around and bending them between crossed, you know, magnetic and electric fields. What will that ever be useful
Rubbish.
for? Like, you know, nonsense.
So let's see. Just to like zoom out a little bit, you know, we talked about the particle accelerators, but her rhetoric regarding the physics community in general, or honestly, the scientific community in general, most academic research is bullshit, all this kind of stuff. You know, researchers are con artists and they're scamming for their grant money. They know it's bullshit, but they have their cozy tax-paid positions.
Yeah.
Can we dig into that? What's your perspective on this rhetoric?
Yeah, we most definitely can dig into that. So I think this all flows from the same place. You know, my central criticism of Sabine's output is that she regularly, and I believe cynically, fails to appropriately represent or steelman the counter arguments to her point. So she seems incapable in a lot of the output that I've watched of saying, look, this is my view, but experts disagree with me, but I disagree with them because A, B, and C. But at least the points on both sides are presented. Instead, she tends to present things as her, you know, the renegade scientist, the only one who's informed and with integrity on this island, and then everyone else is immoral money grabbers.
Fraud,
just stealing money because they don't have any good points on their side, right? Yeah. So everything is sort of presented as this good me versus evil money grabbing scientist. So it comes off as very kind of preaching and lawyering one side. Now, that is very, very good for YouTube engagement, right? But it's not very good for educating the public. So I think this leads to huge audiences being misled, having a distorted view regarding a lot of these topics. And what's more, as you have very correctly said, if you're not putting forward the best arguments on the other side, it almost inevitably leads you down this path where you have to say, these people on the other side are up to no good. If they have no reason for doing what they're doing, you're not presenting those good reasons, you're not steelmanning them, and they're taking 15 billion worth of public funds, then 2 + 2 says they're up to no good, because they're not stupid. They're very, very intelligent people. So they're either delusional or they're stealing money. And I think her inability to present the argument fairly and to work in good faith in that way and present the arguments on the other side has basically led her into a situation where she has no choice but to basically say the people on the other side are bullshitting and stealing money. And I think that's where we've got to. And I think that's incredibly unacceptable. It's even more unacceptable when you have 1.5 million subscribers listening to this, many of whom are lay people who are looking to learn about the science. You can't expect them to know those arguments on the other side. I don't blame them for not knowing those arguments on the other side. I also think it's even more unacceptable when you take this stance where you're the only honest broker. You know, you're talking with the authority of science, and then you're accusing other scientists of wrongdoing. So I think the irony in the situation is that Sabine, in my opinion, has become the very thing that she rails against. She's someone who gives an extraordinarily one-sided view of fundamental physics. She's incapable of acknowledging or actioning any expert pushback and critique. And she's hoovering up a hell of a lot of money without producing anything of particular value to the scientific community. So she would probably call that capitalism. You know, I have an audience and people are listening to me. I call it misrepresenting the case, working in bad faith, and misleading the public while stuffing money into your pockets. But, potato.
This scientists are lying for grant money because they're so greedy. Meanwhile, I would venture that she probably makes at least.
Have you looked at her social blade or whatever it is with like the amount of money she must make per year? Idea that.
What's the average salary for a university physicist? Probably around 100, 120, right? Something around there, maybe a little more. Yeah. But I would bet she's probably making 7 figures.
So it's pretty horrendous to have to kind of sit there and be told that you're stealing money. This is talking about my colleagues and friends, that they're stealing money by someone who is making a hell of a lot of money by throwing out these ideas and also jumping onto every culture war topic that goes past and contrarian topic that goes past. It's very, very hard to listen to be fair. And in terms of and in terms of whether
this is me off from the outside here, and I'm not the one that I feel for you guys, yeah.
And in terms of whether they're stealing the money, one, you said, look, they don't really make that much money, and also there's all these things in place in science to decide what we're going to spend the money on. First of all, that 15 billion doesn't go to Ferraris and mojitos for the people who are working, right? It goes on the damn machine. So the idea that you're going to make bank off these machines is absolutely nuts in the first place.
Yeah.
And then the idea that they're deciding to kind of push these projects because they're the ones that are going to make them money. Well, there's all of these huge community engagement activities that happen. P5 in the US. So this is the project, the Particle Physics Project Prioritization Panel. That's why it's called P5, because it's easier. And the European Strategy, where we get all of the particle physics together, particle physicists together, like every 5 or 10 years. And there's a massive, Royal Rumble debate about what we should be doing for the next 10 years. So the idea that there's just kind of a few people or a few leading figures, this is the idea that Eric Weinstein pushes with people like Whiteson, who are kind of disseminating what we're going to be doing, is just not the case. There's a lot of rigorous debate at these things. I can send you links where the rebuttals of people and, people really pushing back and sharing some of Sabine's points are really highlighted in these discussions. This is not a monolith of opinion. So this idea that they're just sitting around and deciding on the topics that will make money rather than the ones that they actually believe will really drive the science forward is
falling into line with the official narrative.
It's just really, it's embarrassing, and the accusations are just kind of disgusting, really.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to ask, I'd like to ask all physicists this question because you all seem to have slightly different answers, but this other accusation of fundamental physics has not progressed in 70 years, everything is stagnated. What's your opinion of that claim?
So I think this would be someone who has more of a background in the theory can probably talk more accurately to this, but from my interactions with theorists, I think this has become a little bit of a canard, right? These projects take a long time to be realized anyway, so these timescales get stretched out. Sabine herself has acknowledged that as a field progresses, these timescales are going to get longer. The more mature a field gets, the low-hanging fruit has been taken, it becomes more difficult. If you're trying to come up with a theory of everything that puts everything together, of course, that's going to take a hell of a long time. You're going for the absolute hardest things. In terms of no progress, this is usually leveled at the theoretical community, and it's usually leveled towards string theory, right? We've been stuck on string theory. We haven't really got anywhere. Some of the things that people who are more on the theory side flag up to me, and you flagged up some of this in your previous video on string theory, the applications for plasma calculations, for example, I think that Joseph Conlon brought up. There's the ADS CFT duality, conformal bootstrap, these double copy relations, asymmetric symmetries. There's been a hell of a lot of progress in this field, but it's very, very kind of niche progress. It's not a new particle. So people are like, well, where's the new particles? What's
hard to convey, hard to distill into a pop sci article. Yeah.
I would say so. And I would say that, a theorist can probably talk more accurately to what's going on. What I would say in this is that Sabine previously has had a much better track record of being reasonable about these things. So in her book, Lost in Math, which she kind of always tends to cite when she's kind of been trapped by a particle physicist online. Well, as you will see in Lost in Maths, go and look away. Like, don't look at the man behind the curtain kind of thing. She mentions all of this. So she says, for example, direct quote, research on string theory has also brought about the biggest breakthrough in foundational physics in the last decades, the gauge-gravity duality. And then she goes on to say, the implications of this duality are nothing but astonishing. So she's very aware that this progress has been made. She even mentions it in the book that she always points to. But then when it comes to making the polemical videos that she wants to put out, when she wants to do the performative outrage, when she wants to get across this idea that everyone's lying and everything is stuck, suddenly there's this selective amnesia and we go back to no
Oh yeah,
progress
yeah.
has been made
That's the
whatsoever.
Montevideo. I mean, this is precisely what gives me the impression that she is someone who was a disgruntled academic that entered science communication in relatively good faith, that was a little bit crotchety and cynical, but ultimately not entirely dishonest. But that was 10 years ago, and she's just slid down this pipeline until the point where now she's peddling literal fascist propaganda and defending Eric Weinstein, and it's just like she has completely lost track of I mean, she sold out. She sold out for cash is essentially what's going on.
Well, I mean, on some level, I think it's hard to tell, right? I've heard people suggest she's being played by Teal, people suggesting it's audience capture, people suggesting she's just, naturally crotchety, like you say. On some level, it's kind of not important because the downstream effects are exactly the same. The polluting of the science discourse, all of this nonsense getting out there.
Public perception of science
as you
is
said,
eroded.
yeah, as you said, the pushing of this kind of horrible politics. It ends up being the same. I will say, from my point of view, I think there's an incredible amount of evidence that she's cynical in what she's doing. I've mentioned that she does understand the strongest points for building colliders, but then she'll say, "Oh yeah, I know that, but it's not really interesting." She does understand that these things have very positive returns on investment, but she'll say, "No, I don't think that's going to happen." And the World Wide Web would have been made in the private sector if it wasn't made at CERN anyway. All of these arguments on the other side will just be sort of pushed down. So she knows these arguments. It would be one thing if she didn't know these arguments and she was just putting across her opinion. That's fine. She does know these arguments and she intentionally downplays them. And I think that's incredibly cynical. And then I think when you look at her wider output and how it's changed, as you've correctly said, you're looking at things like Trump's science funding cuts might not be all bad.
Unbelievable.
Elon Musk tackles the woke mind virus. Trans in sport, is it fair? Question mark, question mark, question mark. And then you look at the comments that are under these things. It's all the same contrarian culture war figures that you would expect. You then look, who is she hanging around doing a podcast with? Oh, it's Lawrence Krauss now. Oh, it's Eric Weinstein now. I don't want to do the kind of, guilty by association thing, but there's a pattern. There's an editorial line here, which you can steel man any particular piece of content, any individual piece of content, as her fans do. But the through line is so incredibly obvious. And it's been highlighted by people like yourself and Decoding the Gurus as well.
Yeah, blatantly transparent. I think the silver lining here is that she finally went too far, and now it's just become so undeniable to the vast majority of people. Only the most delusional, contrarian, science illiterate, politically captured people still defend her. It's just the cat is out.
When I saw the video defending Eric Weinstein the other week, and the line of that was essentially geometric unity equals string theory, but geometric unity is better because nobody spent any money on it. Which is just an insane point of view to take and not in line with anything that she said. I mean, my initial reaction was, this is nuts. I'm angry about this. Scientists should be angry about this. My theory colleagues should be angry about this. And then I stopped to think, and I thought, look, she's making it so obvious now.
Yeah.
Tying her colors to geometric unity. She was bending herself into a pretzel to kind of slam it, but not slam it, not upset Eric, say nice things about it. It was kind of, I remember, a politician getting on, I think it was Jeremy Corbyn at the time. I don't want to get into the specifics of the politics, but he said something like, somebody said, "Do you condemn this violence?" And he said, "I condemn all violence." It was this kind of thing that she was doing. She was unable to criticize Eric Weinstein appropriately and say, this theory is absolute bullshit for A, B, C, D, E reasons, without then saying, but really, is it his fault? Because everyone's kind of the same, aren't they? It's not really his fault. It was just evasion. And for someone who says that they call spades spades and, is very, very honest and open and the only honest broker out there.
Yeah,
it's so obvious what's being done there. Yeah.
Well, to me, it was beautiful because it's just like Teal Bucks, that's she just kind of laid it all out there. So, yeah.
Well, is it audience capture? Is it a big play? Look, I'm not going to comment on that because,
Well, I think it's all of the above. I think the audience capture led her sufficiently down the pipeline enough that she got scooped up. by the oligarchy, you know.
Well, I think it's certainly, as you said, there has been a change in content, and I think you can track that. And people like yourself and people like Decoding the Gurus have done a fantastic job of saying that. And I think it's unfortunate when someone, she is not a stupid person. She's clearly not a stupid person.
Yeah, no.
I think when you have a lot of experts who are talking to you and saying, look, you're going a little bit far here. This is, this is too far. This is a bit of nonsense. I think when a lot of intelligent people are talking to you and pushing back, you have to have a moment of self-reflection. I've had a situation like this where, I've got involved with certain silly viewpoints. And luckily I have a lot of smart people around me in the community who said, hang on a minute, what about this? What about this? She has that community around, or she should. And I think to go down this pipeline,
alienated everyone around her.
quite possibly, but I think it's quite sad to see, in all honesty.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, those are all the questions I had. So unless you have any other closing remarks, let me know.
No. I mean, all I will say is thank you very much for doing the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly valuable. There's a huge asymmetry online, as you'll no doubt be aware of. Exactly, with the ability to push out nonsense. I imagine your videos, like the ones that I make, take far longer to make than it does to push out nonsense.
They do.
So having somebody pushing back on this and really doing the work, I can only thank you and praise you for doing the work you're doing. I think it's also incredibly valuable that where you don't necessarily have the exact expertise in that particular subject, you're also inviting on people to talk, intelligently about it, which is incredibly powerful, because those people, as I'm sure you'll know, if you want to put out a video about the Higgs potential or a new collider, you might get a few hundred, a few thousand views at best.
That's right.
But you're helping bring those points to the fore. So again, thank you very much for the work you're doing, and I think it's incredible.
You're very welcome, and I relish it. And I'm so glad to see this change within the scientific community in terms of the willingness to collaborate with science communicators like me. It's been tremendous, and I'm so happy to platform all of you.
I think you'll find that most scientists are like that. If you're happy to give them a platform, if you're happy to show interest in the niche piece of work that they're doing, they will chew your ear off, Dave, for as long as you can.
Fair enough.
As long as you can stay there. But yes,
very good.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you as well. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Sam. Now we are going to move on to a highly accomplished theoretical physicist. Michael Peskin has been a professor at Stanford University for decades, working at the SLAC National Accelerator Laboratory. He is also a co-author of the single most widely used graduate textbook on quantum field theory. You'll be hard-pressed to find almost anyone better qualified to discuss the status of theoretical physics than Michael, so let's listen closely to what he has to say.
Michael, thanks so much for joining me. I just wanted to get some of your perspective on Sabine. I understand that you have been watching her videos for some time, and she does tend to portray herself as somewhat of an authority in particle physics. Do you get the impression that this is the case?
She's written papers about particle physics, and in particular, she's written a lot of papers early in her career about the possible appearance of black holes at the LHC and their ramifications. But these are very theoretical papers. I don't get the impression that she's ever gotten into the weeds about how you actually do experiments or what that has to do with the state of the standard model and where we're going with that. I don't consider her even a former particle physicist. She's a quantum gravity theorist who is now morphed into this internet personality. And I think that's all you can say.
Mm-hmm. With regards to particle accelerators, she's really constantly downplaying like the significance of these instruments, whether she's referring to the LHC or other potential instruments that are in discussion for potentially being built. She calls them a scam, or however she chooses to phrase it on any particular day. Can you provide some counterpoint to help us understand why these machines are useful and ideally worth their cost?
Well, I think the thing that you have to realize is that if you want to seek after truth for the fundamental equations of physics, it's really very difficult. We understand how atoms work. We understand how nuclei work in general. Of course, there's a whole field of nuclear physics, which is teasing out the fine points of that. But I think the fundamental laws of how nuclei work and radioactivity we understand very well. And the question is, what else is there? And to find that, you have to look at things at successively shorter distances. So how short a distance can we probe? Well, it used to be said, I don't have to believe in atoms because we can't see atoms. Today, we can see atoms. At my lab, there's actually an X-ray laser, which studies proteins and materials at atomic resolution, and you can pick out the individual atoms and their position and their structure within materials. We can't see atomic nuclei. That's basically a factor of 1,000 beyond, or actually 10,000, beyond the current resolution of our experiments. But we know a lot about atomic nuclei. We look at their spectra, the analog of atomic spectra. We understand how they're built up out of protons and neutrons. And this is a study that's been going on since the 30s. It's very well developed. I would claim that we now understand physics to the level of a part in 10,000 of the size of an atomic nucleus. And the way we understand this is mainly through the results of particle colliders, making, first of all, heavy particles such as the W bosons and the Z boson that mediate radioactivity, studying their properties, also by trying to create very energetic experiments where we don't see protons and neutrons, we see quarks and gluons, their constituents, and we understand the pattern by which those particles interact. We've learned a lot about this from the LHC. In fact, aside from the Higgs boson, probably this is the main thing that we've learned from the LHC. The details of how quarks and gluons interact, it all seems to be consistent with the theory that we have called quantum chromodynamics. But how it works out is extremely subtle and beautiful, and it's revealed in these experiments. So in order to really confirm and understand in subtle detail our current theories of particle physics, and especially in order to go on and understand what's next and what's maybe deeper in the fundamental laws of physics, you need to make these special environments that are created by particle accelerators, visualize the events with these very complicated detectors, and then try and make sense of it. And it's a very difficult endeavor, and there's no substitute for that. Nothing in astrophysics, nothing in cosmic rays can provide the kind of precise information that you need to do this study.
Mm-hmm. So for those who would accept that we are gaining this fundamental understanding of the universe through these experiments, but are obsessed with return on investment and things like that, what are the practical applications that have come from this newfound knowledge?
Well, in Sabine's video, she really dumps on these practical applications. Someone else will invent it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that there are many things that have been invented by particle physicists that were then taken over or done in collaboration with people in other fields. Probably the most famous one is the World Wide Web, which these days people just call the internet. It's something built on the internet, but it's something we use every day on our phones. The World Wide Web was invented because it was difficult to manage particle physics data at CERN. And Tim Berners-Lee had a brilliant idea about how to do that, motivated by this application. Since then, another major trend has been cloud computing. But the first real global cloud computing environment is the LHC data structure, which enabled people from all over the world to look into the petabyte databases that the LHC was providing and study them. And basically, you send to the network your queries and your simulation programs, and it will return to you answers in a very straightforward way. There are lots of other examples in superconductivity, superconducting magnets, superconducting power generators, Those are essential for accelerators. Microelectronics, because oddly, even though we work with detectors that are, the size of tall buildings, the Atlas detector is 6 stories high. What's inside the detectors is of micron scale or smaller, and it has to manage enormous data streams. And how you do that has, to a large extent, been invented by particle physicists. So all of these applications interact with the rest of the technical world, but I think we're a very important part of it. One of my colleagues at Slack is now trying to build AIs that instead of returning answers in milliseconds in normal time, returns answers in nanoseconds because there's an LHC application that demands that. And so when you get really technical problems and really creative people together, you get very interesting solutions, and those transfer themselves out into society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other half of it, what we're going to get from the actual physics knowledge that we obtained from the LHC or from future colliders, that's much more obscure. We don't, in nuclear physics, we have many applications, of course, nuclear reactors, but one shouldn't forget isotopes in medical research came from the study of nuclei. And that was a very important achievement done by at the Bohr Institute in Copenhagen in the 30s. I remember when my dad, who was an academic surgeon, spent a summer at Oak Ridge learning how to use radioisotope tracers to learn how disease progresses in dogs and how to basically do surgery to counteract that.
Mm-hmm.
So eventually, I think there will be applications of what we get out of particle physics, but that's maybe centuries from now. But of course, if you don't build the foundations, you never get it. It's always going to be science fiction until you have some facility to make it fact.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little more about this later.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's very easy to just point at the frontier of science and go, where are the applications, without looking back over the past 200 years and seeing how the practical applications always inevitably came, but it's fundamental understanding first. But speaking of fundamental understanding, there's this common talking point among these internet detractors that fundamental physics has not progressed in 70 years, that it's all just bookkeeping and slight modifications are building upon large strides that were made many decades ago. What would your response be to that?
Well, 70 years is a long time. I mean, 70 years is the 1950s, when we had no clue about how the nuclear interactions work. We didn't even know that radioactivity came from a separate, distinct force of nature from the strong interaction. I remember when I was a kid watching an interview when Li and Yang won the Nobel Prize. And the interviewer said, "You mean there's another force beyond the nuclear force that you guys are concerned with?" And they tried to explain that that was what they'd won the Nobel Prize for discovering that particular aspect.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, my colleagues were able to propose detailed mathematical theories for both the strong interaction and the weak interaction that leads to radioactivity, and unified the weak interaction with electromagnetism, the force that we've understood basically since Maxwell in the 19th century. And it's two very compact packages with very similar equations, very, very beautiful structure. How you get beyond that has been a matter of contention since the 1970s. I started working on this at the beginning of my career. You see, I have gray hair. We are still trying to make progress on that. We'll talk a little more about how that relates to things and what the Higgs boson has to do with it. But what has happened since this theory was written down is that people have been able, with accelerators, to make very high precision tests of this theory and really understand its subtleties. At CERN and also at my lab, SLAC, we did experiments where literally you capture individual Z bosons at rest in the laboratory and you watch them decay. And then you can just learn a tremendous amount about how the interactions of radioactivity work. And so that's the thing that we've been doing so far. These theories from the 70s seem to work extremely well, but it's clear there's something missing, and it's something that we have to find by probably going to higher energies or higher precision or some combination of those things.
Mm-hmm. So that would mean another larger, probably even more expensive instrument. Do you want to make a case for building that since that you see such strong opposition to that from personalities like Sabine?
Well, I think it's natural to say, why do you need the world's most expensive pieces of scientific apparatus to make progress? Can't you do it in some simpler way? And I think even within our community, you can ask, do we just want to keep um, basically building the same accelerator over and over, but just larger and larger? I mean, it's clear that we can't do that forever. Society puts limits on that. And it may be putting limits on even on the next thing that CERN would like to do. People who know me know that I've been involved in putting a proposal in for a much cheaper next facility at CERN that would do much of the physics which people want to do. This is like an inter-community debate, but none of these things are cheap.
Mm-hmm.
You can, they're always at the billion, in today, even the $10 billion class. And I think you have to make a strong argument for it. And eventually, society will say, we can't afford that. You go back and invent something better. Now, recently, I read a paper about a lecture given by Enrico Fermi in 1954. Just before he died, his closing address to the American Physical Society postulated an accelerator that went around the equator of the Earth. And he must have been joking because, of course, that's an impossible thing. But he gave the parameters of it and the cost. And very interestingly, the cost was $170 billion, 1954 dollars. And the capability of it in terms of making the kind of collisions that you would use to study short distances was not as great as the LHC. And the reason that we could build the LHC, which was designed in the 1980s, so that's 40 years ago, instead of the thing that Fermi put forward, is because we had better ideas about how to accelerate particles. And I really think that's the route that we have to go now, especially to make the next step in energy, to think about new technologies for particle acceleration. And I'm very into that. I work with people at SLAC who work on one of those proposed technologies to see if we can make it real.
Mm-hmm.
But, to do something today, we use today's technologies. And with today's technologies, I think also with these advanced technologies, we're still going to be in the billion-dollar class.
Yeah.
And you have to make a strong argument for that. I think we have one.
Yeah, it sounds like the community is very open to new ideas, but if you don't have one and you're just dumping on the ideas that are on the table, what good are you, right? What good are you doing? It's just naysaying. I wanted to give you an opportunity, if there are specific talking points of Sabine's that you take issue with and would like to rebut, I would love to move on to that.
Well, Sabine, I think, is very clear in all of her videos in saying that there's no purpose to the current experiments at the LHC or similar experiments that would be proposed at a higher energy accelerator. We've learned it all. You guys have been trying to go beyond what we call the standard model, this theory of strong, weak, and electromagnetic interactions for a long time. You haven't succeeded. We're done. That's what nature says, and just accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a very unscientific position. She says that there are no reasons why we should expect new laws of physics to emerge in the future. And it's something that I've been working on my whole career to try and imagine what new laws of physics would look like and what they might do. And she says that there's no precedent for this kind of situation in physics. But actually, there's a very interesting precedent, which goes back to the 16th century and Copernicus. So in the 16th century, it was very important to predict the motion of the planets, the moon, because astrology was very important to all of the political figures at that time. That was the way to predict the future. To predict the future, you had to know what the stars were telling you. And over thousands of years, from the time of Ptolemy in the um, Alexandrian period, people had been studying the cosmos and derived a quantitative theory of the motion of planets. And it worked extremely well. You could predict how visible planets like Jupiter and Saturn, Venus, would move across the sky. The problem with this theory was that it actually made no sense. It had odd elements to it. For example, if you watch Mars in the sky, you'll see that at certain points in its orbit, it has what's called a retrograde motion. It turns around and goes backwards for a while, and then it goes forwards again. And this was explained by adding things to the Ptolemaic theory, things called epicycles, where you have motion. Ptolemaic theory was based on everything going around the Earth, but then you would add little circles and extra pieces to the orbit in order to fit the data.
Mm-hmm.
And this is more or less what we have today with the Standard Model. It gives us a good quantitative understanding of the strong, weak, and electromagnetic interaction, but it's built on a foundation of sand. The most crucial parts of it involve this thing called the Higgs boson or the Higgs field. Now, what is this field for? If you write down the Standard Model without the Higgs field, it turns out that the constraints of the model forbid the generation of mass. For the W and Z bosons, which we've discovered, we know they're very heavy, also for all of the quarks and leptons. The reason for that is that this model has, if you like, too much symmetry, and those symmetries forbid the appearance of masses. In order to get around that, you add the Higgs field, which is supposed to basically have a constant value through all of space and pick a direction with respect to the symmetry. So, for example, for the weak and electromagnetic interactions, there are four bosons: the photon, the W plus, the W minus, and the Z boson, all of which are basically symmetrical with one another. And what the Higgs field does is that it picks out one to be massless, that's what we call the photon, and the others to get large masses. This kind of symmetry breaking or directionality of the field is something that we know a lot about from examples in condensed matter physics. In magnetism, for example, the spins in a magnet all orient themselves in the same way, so the magnet produces a magnetic field. It does this spontaneously. You heat up a magnet, it's not magnetized, you let it cool down. Eventually it finds its lowest energy state, and that's a state with all the spins in the magnet aligned.
Mm-hmm.
So the Higgs field is very much like that. There are many other examples in condensed matter physics. Birefringent crystals are twisted in some way, and that's the lowest energy state. The liquid crystals, which are the display on my computer screen, similarly sit down in a certain asymmetric orientation because the molecules are long, stringy molecules that fit together in a preferred orientation. For the Higgs, we just have no clue. There's no reason in the Standard Model why the Higgs orders itself. It's literally put in by hand. And similarly, the masses of all of the quarks and leptons are just numbers put in by hand to fit the data. And if you try and probe the model to understand why those numbers appear rather than other numbers, you get crazy infinite predictions. So the model is manifestly incomplete. You need some substructure, something that will tell you not how things happen, because that's the parameterization of the data, you need something that tells you why these things happen. And to understand why it happens, you need a structure that the Higgs boson lives in. And in all the examples that people have given and proposed as hypotheses, that structure requires new particles, which in principle are accessible to our accelerators. In other words, there are new laws of physics that are just out there that in order to understand how nature really works, we've got to find them and characterize them and find out what kind of structure they live in. And to say that it's stupid to look for those things because nature is what it is, that's not a scientific attitude. And so we ask ourselves the question, what do we have to do? What do we have to build? What do we have to spend in order to make those discoveries and understand nature at a deeper level? This is what scientists have always been doing for hundreds of years. And this is, if you like, one of those kind of bleeding edge features of modern day science. There are lots of other things that are interesting in modern day science, in astronomy, in biology, how DNA is regulated, how that impacts diseases. Particle physics is one of those, but they're all important. I think they should all be pursued to help us gain more knowledge and eventually improve our lives as humans.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to me like the minutia of what to do are very much up for discussion, but the path itself is quite clear and is just physics as usual, from my perspective. What do you make of the motive behind this kind of rhetoric? As you say, it is a very unscientific position. So where does this stem from, do you think?
Well, I don't want to attribute any motive. I don't know Sabine Hossenfelder herself. I've just basically watched her videos, so I don't know where it's coming from. But I think if you're ignorant, it's a very easy thing to say. These people are building billion-dollar facilities. They haven't won any Nobel Prizes. So what's it good for? Um, it doesn't see the big picture. And as I've said before, I don't think that Hossenfelder has experience or qualifications to say there is no big picture, it's just a scam.
Mhm.
I know that people like me and people in my community work very hard to try to extract from the data at these accelerators something that you could call objective truth, something that's reproducible between experiments and even between accelerators. And this is tremendously difficult. Remember, I told you that we're now probing the interactions of nature at distances apart in 10,000 of the size of an atomic nucleus. So this is not simple. We have to gather huge amounts of data. We have to analyze it. We need very complex detectors. The whole enterprise is full of subtlety. And the reason for the subtlety is to reach these extreme points of view very far from the human scale and really, bring back truth, learn something about it which is objective and reproducible. So something that is a good example of this is the discovery of the Higgs boson itself. This is, I think, what everyone agrees is really a major achievement of the LHC experiments. The Higgs boson was postulated in the 1960s to solve this problem of generating mass that I described. In the 1970s, people really got serious about what the Higgs boson would look like in experiments, but it was very far off from the technology of that time. And it really took another 30 years before technology advanced to the point where we could really look for what we call the signatures of the Higgs boson. It's a hard problem. You not only need enough energy, but you also need to deal with huge amounts of data. So let's think about proton-proton collisions. A proton you can think of as a bag of quarks and gluons, which is roughly the size of the proton in an atomic nucleus. So an atomic nucleus has a size which is, depending on the element, 2 to 6 proton sizes in size. So from my point of view, it's a big bag because we're probing distances thousands of times smaller. When two of these bags touch each other, they get ripped open and the quarks and gluons come out. And then you have a very complicated event with many, many tracks, many, many particles created. But that is an event which is due to the ordinary nuclear strong interaction. In order to produce a Higgs boson, you need something special to happen. You need two of these gluons to come close together within 1/1,000 of the size of an atomic nucleus. You need them to be energetic enough that they have the rest energy, mc squared, to produce a Higgs boson. And that interaction, it turns out, is quite weak. And so it requires even more data, more events, more running in order to produce even one Higgs boson. So at the LHC, you produce one Higgs boson in every billion proton-proton collisions. Actually, the Higgs boson was discovered in very special, so the Higgs boson is very short-lived. You don't actually see a Higgs boson in your hand. You see the decay products of the Higgs boson, which you then have to argue came from a Higgs boson rather than something else. The Higgs boson was discovered in special decay modes, which are very characteristic, which occur at the rate of 1 per trillion proton-proton collisions. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, you need a detector that will image these extremely relativistic particles and measure their properties so that you know what they are, which one is a photon, which one is a quark, et cetera, et cetera. Then you need to gather enough data to make up for this factor of 1 trillion. And so then this goes into a data pipeline, which is itself a marvel of engineering. The first factor of 1 million is done by specially built AIs, which have to work faster than human thought. Basically, you get a second to decide whether you're going to consider an event interesting or not, and you throw away the other 999,999 events.
Mhm.
And so this has to be very carefully designed. It has to be calibrated, so you have to have ways of testing that it's doing the right thing, because if you throw away the Higgs boson events, you can never recover them. And then from there on, very sophisticated analysis methods have to be built. Remember, I told you that one of the big achievements of the LHC was to understand how quarks and gluons interact. We see them as jets of particles. So a quark will emit some gluons, which emits other gluons, which emits other gluons. Eventually, it turns into a stream of energetic particles. And what people have been able to learn how to do at the LHC is to understand the structure of those streams. It turns out that this structure actually has a fractal geometry. It's very cool. It's scale invariant, approximately scale invariant, as you look into smaller and smaller pieces of that geometry. And by studying how you violate scale invariance, you can tell different kinds of jets from one another. And this method is actually used to discover the most prominent decay mode of the Higgs decaying to 2 bottom quarks. Bottom quark jets are slightly different from gluon jets and other kinds of jets, and it's revealed in this kind of fractal analysis. And people had to invent that method, basically, in order to get this from the data. So in general, whenever you look for any kind of particle, a predicted one or a new one in the LHC data, it's a tremendous struggle. The LHC is generating tens of petabytes of data. And so you can't just say, well, it's there or it's not. You really have to look for it very systematically. You have to, first of all, understand what all the background reactions are. So if I ask a Higgs boson decaying to 2 bottom quarks, What are the backgrounds to that? Well, if you have an ordinary gluon that turns into two bottom quarks of roughly the mass of the Higgs boson, that has a rate which is 1,000,000 times greater than the rate to produce a Higgs boson and produce two bottom quarks. So you have to do something special to get rid of that factor of 1,000,000. And so people invented methods to do that, to look at special kinds of reactions for which the backgrounds are not so large. But these backgrounds all have to be evaluated. This involves very complex simulation programs written by eventually hundreds of people in collaborations to try and represent what we know about physics at the LHC extremely well. Then, of course, when you have a reaction, it goes through a detector. And the detectors aim to take a photograph of what's going on in the reaction, but all detectors are imperfect. And so it's very easy for reactions of a similar kind to fake the signature that you're interested in. And so that also has to be evaluated. So there are tools that model every tiny piece of the detector. These are written in these collaborations by thousands of physicists. And then they're structured in such a way that a graduate student can use these tools and eventually write a whole PhD thesis about, I searched for this particular signature of this particle, and I either found it or I didn't, or I imposed constraints on it. Mm-hmm. For the Higgs boson, it's part of the standard model theory. And so we knew what we were looking for, and then you could really home in very specifically on what you should look for, and eventually people managed to discover it above the levels given by these calculated backgrounds. For things that are part of this unknown structure that the Higgs boson lives in, there are hundreds of theories. We don't really know what we're looking for. What we need to do is exhaust the capabilities of the accelerator to search out all of them and see whether we can find something that gives us a clue. Mm-hmm. It's a very difficult and technical endeavor, and the people who work on it are very dedicated to this. Yeah. Staying up all night, writing computer programs, analyzing the data, trying to tease out some small signal from, as I've said, some of the largest databases that exist on Earth.
Mm-hmm. To me, that's a very convincing case for the necessity of these instruments, and the profundity of what is uncovered by this kind of research, this scale, as you said, this minuscule scale that we are probing of the fundamental nature of reality. It just blows my mind every time I think about it.
It blows my mind, frankly.
So yeah, that's why I have very little patience for naysayers.
So before we finish, I'd like to make two other points. Earlier in this discussion, we talked about the possible value of things that we might learn from particle collider experiments. And so I just wanted to give a little example of that. Now, what we're going to learn, of course, we have no idea. We don't know what the laws of physics are beyond our current standard model. We're searching in the dark. We have even less idea of what the applications are. But I would like to point out one kind of science fiction idea that I think is not ruled out, and it's really very interesting from the point of view of future society. A lot of science fiction stories talk about a box that you can shovel your garbage into, and out comes pure usable energy. We're talking about 100% of the MC squared of the garbage. I remind you that a hydrogen bomb only gets a few percent of the mass energy that you put in. In order to get 100%, you have to basically somehow convert matter to antimatter and then have an annihilation which is very efficient. Now, there is actually a theoretical idea that realizes this, but it's a very strange one. There's something called a magnetic monopole, which is the analog for magnetism of electric charge. And in the 1980s, Callan and Rubikoff showed that if you put magnetic monopoles in a box and shovel in ordinary matter, it has this order 100% conversion of matter to energy. It's a very interesting theoretical idea called the Kalin-Rubikov effect. Now, unfortunately, we also know that there are not enough magnetic monopoles in the universe to make this a practical idea. But what I want to say is that it's out there somewhere. I think it's not at all stupid to say that if we knew a lot about the Higgs field and its partners, and we knew how to twist up the Higgs field in the right way to scramble matter and antimatter, we could build such a device. We have no idea whether that's possible. We don't know anything about the theories of the Higgs boson that would permit that. But as I say, this is really within the realm of science. And it's something that in the 23rd century, maybe humanity could benefit from. That's just one notion of what could be out there if we continue to study the fundamental laws of physics. And I think, as I say, it's not stupid to dream about those things, dream about other things in science fiction that we could make real if we really understood nature to a much more subtle level. Okay, the second point that I wanted to make had to do with something that I saw in Sabine's video called How I Became the Public Enemy #1 of Particle Physicists. At the beginning of that video, she talks about how she's gotten a lot of negative feedback by email and messaging from particle physicists. And as I say, I'm not surprised because I think her message is fairly ignorant of what we do and how hard we work and how dedicated we are to bring real understanding in nature. But in particular, she spent a lot of time on a message that she received from a man named Tord Riemann, a worker at the Daisy Zeuthen laboratory, where he said, "I find your comments on the dedicated, sophisticated work of myself and colleagues respectless. It would be a good idea for you to leave basic research. You don't have the spirit needed." And she took this as an insult, which actually I guess it is, but some old man out there who just wants to annoy her life. Well, obviously she didn't know who Tord Riemann was. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2021, but he's one of my heroes. Remember that I told you that you need detailed simulations of the physics of the standard model in order to either test the standard model or to make discoveries. In the 1990s, Riemann was the lead author of the most important of these programs used to analyze the data at LEP, a program called ZFitter. I've used it, thousands of my colleagues have used this program to understand the precision data on the weak interactions. He was a very selfless man. He never sought the limelight. He never invented particles with funny names. He never really sought a reputation outside of particle physics. He devoted his life to making it easier for our community to extract truth from data. Really admirable person, one whom I don't like to see disparaged, and one who really provides the model for what we want to do, for which I think Sabine Hossenfelder provides just the opposite. Okay, well, thanks for listening.
Yeah. Now the question is, how many subscribers did he have, right? He's not very influential. But yeah, I think you've brought a lot of clarity. I think you're from the perspective of someone who is doing the work and who is, just knows what is happening in particle physics, where it's been and where it's going. Unless this is just the script of a shill trying to get more grant money, as Sabine would say. I think this has brought some clarity here. So thank you for that.
Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. And I'm interested to see how this is going to look on a video.
Thanks, Michael. Moving right along, let's talk to Daniel Whiteson, an experimental particle physicist and professor of physics and astronomy at UC Irvine and experienced science communicator. Dan has plenty of insight when it comes to the intentions and integrity of the physics community and the deliberate distortions that Sabine engages in. Let's have a listen.
Dan, thanks so much for joining us. I think my viewers know you best as the physicist who brought Ashton Forbes to my attention. And word on the street is you're dodging debate with him, right? Just because, despite your very clear instructions for him to email you if he wants to chat. Yeah, that hasn't been followed through. But anyway, we're here to talk about Sabine. So in her latest video defending Eric Weinstein, she made some very bold claims about how GU is just as pointless as what all the other physicists are doing, and that you all write papers in bad faith to get grant money you don't deserve and all this kind of stuff. We got to get your take on this. What do you think?
Well, I think Sabina has a lot of excellent videos where she explains science, and I appreciate that. But I think that folks should understand that from the point of view of the inside of the field, her description of physics and physicists is just not one that's recognizable. We are just curious people trying to understand the universe, asking questions and investigating it. Nobody's here to trying to scam money off the government. We could all have much more lucrative jobs, optimizing burrito taxis or something if that was our goal. We're here because we want to understand, and nobody's writing papers in bad faith. Everything is just inspired by curiosity. And we have ideas that work and ideas that don't work, but we also have a process for filtering through what ideas are good ideas and bad ideas. And that comes from a community consensus. So the whole idea of us as cartoon villains, hatching these schemes to try to steal money from the government and to try to quiet dissent, it's just, it's not something that I recognize at all in my experience. I don't know any physicist who operates that way.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to go the money route, let's compare net worth of Eric Weinstein,
Yeah.
Sabine Hossenfelder, and you and me, right? I mean,
Let's not.
yeah, definitely think the scale would tip in their favor.
Yeah.
What do you make of her? I mean, I know that you're not specifically a string theorist, but from your perspective, I'm sure you have colleagues that work in string theory. Why is string theory this boogeyman for Eric and Sabina?
I think it's an easy target because it's so mathematical, and they're right that it's not something we can immediately test, but that doesn't mean that it's not a valuable thing to think about. Whole fields of mathematics are maybe useless from the point of view of science, or maybe they're going to transform the way physics is done. Think about group theory. That's just something a bunch of mathematical nerds invented because they like thinking about math games in their heads, not because they thought, hey, this is going to underlie all of particle physics a century later. It's just good to let nerds think about stuff and figure things out. It's the best way to understand the universe. Sometimes it takes 10 years, sometimes 100 years, but I still think it's worth the investment. It's just an easy target because it's so abstract and so hard for the normal person to understand.
Right.
And also because it was sold with a lot of hype. They did think it was going to make a lot of progress, and it turned out to be different from what they thought. And there's always this danger of telling people we're going to discover X, and then it turns out you discover Y. But the thing about research is that nobody knows what it's going to yield. That's the benefit of it, right? It's exploration. It's like when you land a rover on Mars, you don't promise we're going to find little green men. You just should sell it on the principle of exploration. Let's go see what's there.
What are we
Maybe
gonna
something
find?
bonkers. Yeah.
It's interesting you bring up group theory as an example because I specifically remember that being a big part of when I learned inorganic chemistry, right? It has a lot to do with these properties of these molecules.
Really? I didn't know that. That's very cool.
It's, so yeah, in terms of this hype though, it's I guess we could say that there are researchers that engage in hype, but is it an unfair characterization to assign that to the entire scientific community or the entire physics community?
I think, there are examples of people who have definitely said things that were nonsense. Gordy Kane, for example, is a big proponent of supersymmetry, and he probably said a lot of ridiculous things about how we would definitely discover supersymmetry at the Large Hadron Collider. But, he doesn't speak for the field. He speaks for himself.
Yeah.
And everybody's out there selling their research program, just like Sabina is, and just like she has. I sympathize with her. She's had grants rejected and she's had proposals that I'm sure she thought were great ideas that were turned down. So have we all.
Yeah.
That's just part of being out there in the world, and not just in academia and in physics, right? You try to sell a script to Hollywood, you try to
Sure.
launch a company. Sometimes they fail, even if they were a great idea. But that doesn't mean you have to say that the field is rigged against you or that people are scheming to put your ideas down. If your idea fails in the marketplace of ideas, maybe it just wasn't the right idea for the time. You don't have to suggest that everybody else is operating in bad faith.
Yeah, imagine if every scientist who had a grant rejected started this whole anti-science campaign on
Yeah.
YouTube trying to lambast the entire scientific community, literally the entire scientific community, as I've had to
Yeah.
reiterate multiple times for people who weren't quite getting the message.
Yeah, and the solution, I agree with her that we should fund more crazy ideas. We shouldn't be so narrow. I agree that we should have mainstream physics, and then we should have a bunch of crackpot things on the fringe that people are trying that maybe is going to reinvent everything.
Mhm.
Totally. The way to do that is to increase the funding for research, right? To make it possible to fund more and more a greater diversity of ideas and directions, not to defund academia and to shut down science and to, cause people to distrust the entire institution. So that's my message is yeah, let's have more funding for research because then we'll get to support people like Sabina and other people with ideas that maybe will work out or maybe not, or maybe will revolutionize how we understand the universe.
Hmm. Well, I'm not too sure that she's very concerned with her own work. I think she's kind of left that by the wayside in favor of this kind of inflammatory rhetoric that makes her quite a lot of money. I don't know how much you've heard or listened to her when she talks about these topics. Do you get the sense that she has even a substantive understanding of many of these aspects of theoretical physics, or is she speaking from a place of ignorance, or what?
She's definitely not ignorant. No, she has a solid background in theoretical physics for sure, and she's worked in quantum gravity, and she knows a lot more about that topic than I do, certainly. So she knows what she's talking about. That makes it a little even harder to understand, her critiques somehow, because other folks, Terrence Howard or the other folks, we know they don't know what they're talking about, but she certainly does. And she's more like in the Avi Loeb category of somebody who has seen things from the inside and knows how they work. And so it's harder to reconcile that with my experience of physics because her description of it just does not jibe with my experience.
Yeah, it exposes the motives a little more clearly in that context. Yeah. Well, I can't think of any other questions. If you had any other comments with regards to Sabina's rhetoric or even Eric Weinstein or just reflections on this whole debacle, this community, where this rhetoric is coming from, go for it.
I just think we should assume that people are operating in good faith. You don't understand what somebody else is doing doesn't mean that they're scheming against you. And I think we'd get a lot further if we operated that way.
Fair enough. Very cool. Thank you for the insight.
Yeah, happy to chime in.
Thanks, Dan. Just two more to go. Now let's talk to Ivano Basile, a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Physics in Munich. Hey, that's Sabina's home turf. It's also the publicly funded institution whose results Sabina falsely attributed to the private sector in my previous video. Anyway, Ivano has quite a bit to say about Sabina's deceptive rhetoric. Let's listen up.
Ivano, thanks so much for joining us. And I think you have a little presentation here. I think we're going to talk a little bit about Sabina's claim that geometric unity is just as good or just as bad, however she wants to frame it, as all the other physics out there. So I think you have a few slides here to help us clarify what's going on.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure. So yeah, this is supposed to be sort of an overview of this narrative that people like Sabine, but also Eric Weinstein and many others on the internet sort of spread about, let's say, fundamental theoretical physics in general, particularly string theory, since that is, a big chunk of it when it comes to quantum gravity and, the final layer of, let's say, theoretical physics. This is, of course, my perspective as a string theorist, but it's it's a perspective that I think is well informed in the sense that I spend a lot of time thinking about other points of view. I engage with other communities quite a lot. So I try to put together things in a way that make sense. All right, so let's say this narrative that I would like to critique is I think we can place it in mainly two bins, right? So as you said, the first is this idea that any ideas in fundamental physics are equal, whatever that means, equally good, equally stupid, equally pointless, right? And the other is this idea that, even if we focus on, let's say, mainstream physics in this field, which of course, people like Sabine actually went above and beyond that to generalize to all of science, but that's another story. Even just within fundamental physics, this idea that it's dead, that it's stuck, right? This idea that we are just standing in our ivory tower, just dilly-dallying in abstract mathematics without any meaningful physics behind it.
Useless. Soaking up grant money doing nothing.
Exactly, like sitting, on our cushy taxpayer money, whereas actually I'm having kind of a hard time to find a job for my next, position. But yeah, so I wish that were true, but yeah. So yeah, I would like to criticize both aspects by basically affirming and substantiating that we can and we do in fact compare different ideas against criteria that are scientifically sound. They're not just like, oh, this community is popular, it's bigger, therefore it receives more funds or whatever, and therefore this idea is better. No, that's nothing like that. Like string theory was extremely niche before it actually produced substantial theoretical results, and then people started paying attention in the 80s or so. So that's not the order of things that these people try to pretend sometimes. So we can and we do compare theories, and we can and do make progress within theories. We're not just stuck in law lost in math or anything like that. Of course, as you point out in several instances, science is not perfect, and sometimes progress can be slow, or it can be difficult to communicate to the public. But nevertheless, this narrative is misleading and it's damaging, in my opinion, to our community, both because lay people are misled to think that we're just doing nothing, and both because when it comes to, of course, dealing with organizations that handle scientific funding, sometimes it can potentially be difficult to make the case for this kind of research, right? So yeah, I structured these slides to address first the first part first, and then the second, with some summary at the end. So let's start with the first point, right? So this idea that all ideas are equal, let's say string theory is on the same playing field as GU, for example, since this is an example that was made in recent videos. The basic point is that we are not just pulling ideas out of our hats like that, right? The methodology is to stay really anchored at what worked, right? The basic physics principles that essentially led us to the modern framework of theoretical physics, which is well established, right? The Standard Model, general relativity, in their modern formulations. And these principles are just essentially the principles of quantum mechanics and relativity, right? So essentially, there is no other way of having physics compatible with these principles that does not look like what we have, at least qualitatively, the broad strokes, right? Relativistic quantum field theory, including gravity, so including general relativity, in a way that, of course, it's not a fully complete theory, but it's an approximate theory that works at low energies, low resolutions. It's essentially inevitable to get this kind of framework when one begins with the very solid, well-established principles of quantum mechanics and relativity. And this has been documented, several times. And here I'm putting like this screenshot of one of the many seminars of Nima Arkani Ahmed that you can find. And he's one of the people who actually really emphasizes this, right? That this kind of framework for physics within at least the range of accessible energies so far is inevitable, right? We don't get just to invent physical theories, as we like, right?
Mhm.
So based on this sort of conservative approach based on principles that worked, and then we understand the idea, the notion of having a quantum theory of gravity, which is fully complete, it never breaks down, and is consistent with these principles, is extremely constraining. These principles are much, much more rigid than one might think, right? So we don't get just to invent whatever, in particular stuff like GU, right?
Yeah, you're not just inventing operators out of thin air and not defining them, right?
And not defining them. But exactly, but the point is that even if we did define them, right, the chances that such a construction would actually work, namely it would be consistent with these physical principles, is essentially zero, right? Like the things that actually work are extremely sparse. That is the main point here. So not all ideas are equal. And the other point here that I want to emphasize is that these principles are physical principles. They are grounded in physics, right? It's not just, we use operators or Hilbert spaces or some other abstract mathematics.
Right.
That math is at least one way to describe this physics. But the point is that the principles are physics, right? This is what I really want to emphasize. And here, for example, in this screenshot I put there, at this particular timestamp, Nima is emphasizing how, and this is 2011, by the way, before the confirmation of the Higgs boson, right? He was explaining how the Higgs boson is essentially inevitable, right? Like the community really decades before the discovery understood that it was needed to save one of the principles of quantum mechanics from breaking down, right? Unitarity, the conservation of probability, so to speak, right? So, and one of the things that in particular Nima emphasizes, as I pointed out in this reference, is that the procedure of just changing the rules of the game for fun or no particular reason never actually worked, right? So the way the theoretical fundamental physics progressed has always been by understanding, the deeper reason behind some refinement of the principles, never actually just throwing things out and starting anew. Like, let's modify gravity, let's change quantum mechanics. Now, of course, there are people who try to do that, and I'm not saying they shouldn't. In particular, I think, Sabine, for example, seems to be an advocate of changing the rules of quantum mechanics at some fundamental level. Now, my position, and I think somehow the position of good part of the community, at least in my field, is that there's no evidence that this is necessary at all. Quantum mechanics seems to work perfectly. And even the conceptual aspects that are, debated can be solved, or at least argued to have an answer within quantum mechanics itself, right? And let's say, even if one did modify quantum mechanics in a way that somehow reproduced all of the well understood established physics, which is already a tall order, there's no evidence at all that I can see that this would lead to a good solution of, the problem of quantum gravity, right? So we have a theory that is consistent with these principles, contains gravity and so on. So I don't really see the point of, trying to change the rules in the first place, but also to make the case that somehow all these ideas are on the same level when one is not even, well defined, let alone, let's say, the standard of rigor that we're talking about, let alone consistent with these principles. Whereas one is absolutely consistent with these principles and reproduces the qualitative features of quantum field theory, general relativity, and so on, in a way that is calculable, precise. Of course, the theory is not complete by any means, nor completely understood by any means, and there are, questions that we're trying to answer. We're trying to answer, what is a full definition of the theory? What is is there a realistic configuration that looks like our universe within the theory? But I'll come to that. Yeah. So this is sort of the diagram that I was trying to hint at, right? The principles of quantum mechanics and relativity, at least at low energies, like as argued by people like Weinberg and so on, really essentially imply in a very solid, well understood way that physics at low energies, relativistic quantum physics, is described by essentially quantum field theory. Here I put the acronym EFT, that stands for effective field theory, which is the sort of common ground standard since more or less the 70s, since we understood that most quantum field theories are valid up to some range of energies, and we have a systematic understanding of how to encode the physics that the theory is missing, right? So the modern understanding, for instance, of the Standard Model and GR is that they fit together as an effective field theory that works perfectly well to explain, fundamental physics as we can probe it experimentally. It's incomplete, and we can parameterize the ignorance, right? We can parameterize the bits that we don't understand with some, parameters that in principle can be measured and so on, right? So this is well-established physics. And already the fact that this framework exists and it's so solid and successful, I would say already debunks the narrative in itself, right? Mm-hmm. So any approach to quantum gravity, or let's say a completion of this framework that is valid to all energies for all possible physics, all possible processes, is extremely constrained. Not anything goes. In fact, almost nothing goes. That is the main message I want people to take home here. Now, within this almost nothing that does work, string theory is an example, of course. And here I wanted to point out, in the spirit, again, of not all ideas are equal, that there are some hints that string theory is sort of, some ingredients, at least, of string theory do appear, just from the consistency with basic principles, at least if one considers some, a quantum gravity theory that is weakly interacting in a precise sense. So there is some research that shows this, right? And another point that I want to make here is that because this framework is as such, right, and we understand it very well, it is absolutely trivial that direct experimental access to new quantum gravity effects should be very difficult, right? So this idea that, you guys haven't found anything in 50 years or whatever, I would be surprised if we find anything in this way in 500, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense of direct experimental access of quantum gravitational physics. Of course, there can be indirect consequences of quantum gravity, right? That sort of feedback through low energy physics that we can actually access via accelerators, for example, or cosmological observations. I will hint at some of it later, but my point is that the direct experimental access is, should be difficult to achieve. Otherwise, physics as we know it wouldn't work. That is the main point. Mm-hmm. Yet we still make progress in several ways, right? So, for example, this recent research, by which I mean roughly the last decade, right, that shows that at least when quantum gravity is weakly interacting, it has some features of string theory that follow from the basic consistency. This kind of research basically takes some basic things that you can investigate in any quantum theory of gravity, like scattering particles, right? Or black hole, processes that involve black holes. And you can study whether these processes, if you push them to a limit, in a sense that they become sensitive to what quantum gravity looks like beyond this effective field theory approximation, having consistency with, causality, for example, or unitarity, or matching black hole physics with particle scattering, reproduces features of string theory, namely these weakly interacting theory of, that completes quantum field theory has to have extra degrees of freedom that really seem to look like the oscillations of strings, right? They arrange in some tower of harmonics. The technical term is higher spin mode of increasing mass. The type of scattering, probabilities that one can compute, at least qualitatively, look like the precise predictions of string theory and so on. Then one can go beyond that. One can study what happens when, space-time itself is quantum mechanical and therefore fluctuates, the topology changes, and holography becomes important, right? This idea that the physics of quantum gravity be encoded not in the space-time itself, but equivalently at its boundary, right? All of these ideas that can be argued independently in several ways that have nothing to do with string theory actually reproduce features of string theory from various angles, right? And as I said, I try to engage with other communities on a regular basis, and I discussed, I'm not the only one to do this, but there are discussions, right, between communities, especially within the young people, that critically examine really which assumptions lead to which results, right? So any debate, any serious debate that goes on in this kind of field is really predicated on some physical grounds that are shared, right? It's not just based on, what one fancies or,
Yeah, what you guys do in your abstraction has to then correlate with what astrophysicists are looking at in the universe, right?
Yeah, and at the very least, the weakest of these links is that the basic principles of the underlying physics are exactly the same,
Yeah.
right? And those principles are strong enough that can lead, to basically the framework of standard physics that we understand. We're just trying to add what it's missing. That's all. That is really what we're doing. Yeah. So, this was sort of my way to address the first part, namely, not all ideas are equal. In particular, ideas like GU not even, don't even qualify, I would say, whereas, others are sensible and are investigated by serious researchers. Now, one objection that one could raise is, yeah, whatever, this is just abstract. Who cares that my theory is consistent with principles? What I care about is that it's consistent with experiment. It's a sort of fair point, at least superficially, to make, because of course the easiest way to make a theory consistent with experiment is to make it consistent with physical principles that lead to, the right predictions in the first place. But still, the second point of the presentation, that fundamental physics is stuck or lost, has mainly to do with this story of predictions of how to connect with the real world that we actually observe, right? And here the situation, of course, it was somehow muddled several decades ago up until today by people who wanted to raise some hype, right? So this did happen from several communities. But here I'm trying to give like a transparent account of what I really think the situation is like in quantum gravity, specifically in string theory, but really generically for any possible proposal, right? What would the situation look like? Well, as I said before, the basic insight of the well-established framework of EFT is that direct consequences of genuinely quantum gravitational effects are tiny at the energies that we can access in the foreseeable future, right? So worst case scenario, we have to probe the Planck energy scale to see them, right? Worst case, we could be luckier than that, but the point is that the only true obligation for a quantum gravity theory is to predict these high energy signatures that I'm talking about. And string theory does, right? As any good quantum theory of gravity should. So, for instance, there were very, old estimations of how the very high energy behavior of string scattering, what it looks like. And at the very least, we know that, at least to the extent that we can compute these things, this behavior is consistent with the expectations of what quantum gravity should do. Namely, if you scatter particles at very, very high energies, they should start producing black holes in the middle before scattering out, right?
Mhm.
And this kind of process should become the dominant process in this regime. And the profile that one gets, the type of cross sections, if you want the technical term, that one should get are the qualitative profile is quite precise, and there is a match, right? So there is sort of an energy scale where we expect that scattering particles should start producing black holes, and this there should be some sort of a crossover between what the weakly interacting string theory predicts and what the black hole domination predicts. And string theory does the job perfectly. So the transition works, right? To the extent that we can compute it, it does work.
Mhm.
So at least this very basic consistency check works. But in any case, my point is that the prediction is there. It's a technological issue, right? And as far as experiments that we can access tomorrow or in the next 10 years, right? There is an obligation to actually give those predictions uniquely. And it's not a quantum gravity thing, it's a physics thing. Because any physical theory has some, low energy configurations, or vacua if you want, but I don't think it's the fully accurate term. But the point is that it can have many. So obviously you have to choose one. It's like, I can predict the motion of planets, but I need initial conditions, right? Like I cannot just fix them uniquely from the laws of physics. I need some input. And of course, if you start from the very fundamental theory, having a low energy input can be very difficult, right? We don't just get to choose it by hand, because the theory tells you what the possibilities are for the low energy configurations. Now, this is the so-called landscape problem. The fact that the string theory has this large set of possible low energy configurations. And the idea is that low energy physics is predicted completely upon choosing this configuration, right? But my point is that not only it's not a string theory problem, it's a physics problem, right? Any physical theory has this characteristic. You could say, whatever, but I want a physical theory that has only one low energy configuration, so there you go. Well, not even the standard model has that. In fact, the standard model has a plethora of low energy configurations when you include gravity, right? So it's not like the problem is somehow absent in the standard model and string theory is especially bad or anything. It's just that in the case of the standard model, it's easy to pick the right configuration that describes our universe, and none of the others do. It's easy because that kind of physics operates at the scales that we can actually probe experimentally. So it's not a string theory problem, is what I'm trying to say. Any possible quantum gravity theory would have the same problem because the standard model itself has it, right? Except in that case, it's easy to solve. Now, this, of course, it's a problem that people are trying to solve. This is sort of the field of string phenomenology, as it's called, and there has been progress in this field. There are many directions that people investigate: how to reproduce the correct particle physics content, what dark matter can look like in these low energy sectors of string theory. What about axions, which are particular kind of particles that are hypothesized to solve certain problems in the standard model? Dark energy, and several things that the community has been saying about dark energy, namely that it should change with time, it shouldn't stay constant, etc. There are hints from recent data from the DESI experiment that actually this seems to be favored, right? The change in dark energy with time. And people, of course, are trying to understand, the
With
connections.
the expansion of the universe, you mean, right? Or...
Yes, dark energy as in the driving, the contribution to the apparent energy density of the universe that drives the expansion.
As space-time expands, that should affect the impact of dark energy. Yeah.
Absolutely. And of course, this recent DESI survey has found some evidence that dark energy is not constant, right? The density of dark energy is not constant with time. And, this is something that, in string theory is fairly natural to obtain, so some dynamical dark energy. I know people have been making progress in understanding, how it could be realized. Maybe we don't look for a cosmological constant, maybe we look for other kinds of dark energy that we can realize. There are all sorts of directions that people have pushed in string phenomenology. So my point is there is progress. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now there is also another kind of progress, which is based on this idea that yes, there is a landscape, right? This set of low energy, configurations of the theory that describe, the same underlying laws of physics, but different approximations at low energies with different particles, different interactions at low energies. The point is that even though the set is huge, and as I said before, people have been making progress in trying to find realistic models within this huge set, we also realized that this set, huge as it is much smaller than we thought in some sense. What this means is that maybe 20 years ago, people thought, the set is so huge, anything goes. Give me some low energy quantum field theory coupled to gravity that looks like the standard model. I can make it happen. It will be there. The haystack is so big, it's going to be there. No, we learned that the opposite is true, right? We are gathering more and more understanding and evidence that this landscape, the set of options that string theory produces, is not like that. Not anything goes. In fact, the opposite. Almost nothing goes, right? I could be more specific and technical, of course, but the point is that since we learned this, we tried to understand whether this, this set of options, big as it is, maybe it's finite, and maybe has some patterns within it, right? So maybe these patterns, these commonalities between these low energy, field theories that string theory produces, can give us some room to make predictions that are, not specifically tailored to that particular choice of vacuum, right? But rather they are universal. Any possible low energy field theory coming from string theory would do that, right? Maybe, for instance, there are some speculative ideas in this direction that, say stuff like, anytime that the density of dark energy is very small, such as in our universe, this other thing happens, right? And this other thing could possibly be measured because this is a low energy physics effect. It's an indirect consequence of string theory rather than, very direct scatter particles at super high energies kind of thing. It's a more subtle way of looking for predictions at energies that we can access. But we are beginning to understand this kind of process. We're trying to, understand which of these universal patterns that we seem to glimpse actually, are true, are predicted by the theory. So maybe this is a sort of a summary of the situation as I see it. When it comes to reproducing, known physics, known particle physics and cosmology, that is a hard problem that people are making progress on. But when it comes to predictions for new physics, what is required, in my opinion, is that the high energy physics be somehow fixed, and it is, except it's too hard to probe directly. But then the low energy physics, the low energy predictions should only be, fixed once you choose a vacuum or a low energy, phase of the theory, of which there are many. As I said, not a strings problem, it's a physics problem. And this is exactly what the case is here. So maybe what people really would like is low energy predictions that we can access, but that do not depend on the specific choice of vacuum, right? That are universal and would be true regardless. So universal low energy predictions from string theory. This is the golden, the apple, I don't know how to call it, what we would really like to have. but this is my point is that this is not required. Like there is no physics theory that ever, was required to do this. And yet we may be able to obtain this kind of thing. That there is some work in progress, and the experiments may be doable because it depends on what kind of scales we find. But for instance, one of these somewhat speculative proposals involves testing deviations from the Newton law of gravitation at separations that we can actually probe in the next decade, right? And people are doing this experiment; they're building it, right? I think in Vienna or something.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other similar things, like in cosmology, there are some observations of some cosmological perturbations that could perhaps, conform to some pattern that may or may not be universal in string theory. We're just, working on it. That's how science works. So yeah, this is sort of my summary here of how basically the theoretical methodology is sound and solid, and it shows that, first of all, not ideas are the same, and rather they are very critically examined and compared, and that they're based on physics, not in abstract mathematics. And then of course the situation with predictions that I explained before, for in particular this idea that there are some low energy signatures, very specific ones like supersymmetry or extra dimensions, that we should have seen in the past 50 years or so. That was completely false, right? It was just hype. It was never required, even though it would have been nice, of course. But there is no indication from the fundamental understanding of the theory that any of this should have happened. What really should happen necessarily, if the theory is correct, is that if you scatter particles at very, very, very high energies, you do a certain thing. The cross sections look in a certain way and so on. They match black hole production and so on. But everything else is a bonus, and people make progress in this direction. That was basically what I was trying to say.
Very good. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think even though most of us can't follow along with every last bit of detail here, I think it's pretty easy to tell that there's a certain level of rigor that is going on with the legitimate physics community that is lacking from something like GU or Eric Weinstein. What do you make of Sabine's defense of this? Like, is she even in a position to comprehend what you guys are doing, or what's happening with Sabine?
Honestly, I mean, from what I saw from the recent videos, it's and some posts even, it's completely indefensible. I would say, like, there's no substance there, right? I mean, as I explained, in legitimate fundamental theoretical physics and beyond, of course, we write stuff down, we compute stuff, like there are things we can actually compare and look at, evaluate. There's none of that in GU, right? There's not even, let's forget that the theory isn't even written down to any intelligible extent, right? There's no, as Sean Carroll said, where's the Lagrangian? Of course, there doesn't need to be a Lagrangian, but there does need to be something, something that we can, grab onto.
Something
Yeah, like
concrete. Yeah.
something concrete. Where is the low energy effective quantum field theory description or whatever? Like where is the, where are the objects that appear in any fundamental physical theory? In some approximation whatsoever.
Yeah.
So there's absolutely no comparison. And I think Sabine's work in physics, when she used to work in physics, was along the lines of modified gravity, or like these attempts to sort of replace dark matter with some changes in the physics of general relativity, which didn't pan out. But the point is that it's not just that they didn't pan out for maybe some astrophysicists would say that there is some experimental evidence that I'm not super expert on, but stuff like bullet cluster and other pieces of evidence that suggest strongly that dark matter is matter. Not only that, but from side of the story that I can understand better, these theories are rife with theoretical problems. Like they violate causality sometimes. They are incompatible with GR, with other things of GR that we know, we tested very well at large distances. Like there are clear conflicts at a very basic theoretical level with these kinds of things. So one might wonder, after a short, research career in these kinds of directions, what one could, be able to say concretely about the cutting edge developments of like, quantum gravity or string theory specifically or stuff like that, which are, of course, extremely technical and, surely we could do a better job of explaining them to lay people, but, someone who purports to understand everything and like, oh, here's this paper, oh, look, let me tell you how it's bullshit and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's not really
Obviously,
defensible.
you guys have a very difficult job. This is some of the most abstract science imaginable, and explaining it to lay people or even science communicators like me is very hard. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have this mastery of what it is that you guys do. I certainly don't. I can understand from the periphery some of the things that you're saying in the way of these concrete predictions and I learned through Christian about the ADS-CFT with the predicting the quark-gluon plasma, the density of the quark-gluon. I mean, these are real. It's just that the public doesn't know about that, right? They have to be told, and they're just seduced by this narrative. I think it's just very, very transparent and very easy at any time in the history of science to just point at the frontier of science, what it is that we're working on now, and say, hey, those idiots haven't figured that out yet, so all of science is wrong. You can do it any time. Today, 1930, 2250, you can do it at any time, and it will always be something that you can do to trick people into rejecting science or denying science. So I don't know, like with Sabine, I feel like she finally went over the line and said something that made so many people go, all right, okay. I think if she's pretending that GU is as good or bad or the same or whatever as all of this legitimate physics, I think it's finally time to ignore her completely.
No, that was like, let's say even before, way before your first video on her.
Yeah.
Within our community, I mean, of course, during the actual scientific activities, her name or Weinstein's name and so on, they don't even, appear in the slightest. We don't care at all.
Totally
So,
irrelevant.
Sorry?
Totally irrelevant people. Yeah.
Right, totally irrelevant. And this narrative of, physicists are scared or they should be scared. It doesn't even cross our minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yet, outside of the work environment, their names, when they do appear, they are sort of heavily criticized, right? Like we, as a community, really were already against what she was saying way before all of this started.
Right.
On
Way
the
back with her book and everything, and
exactly. So when bigger like channels like yours started to actually do some pushback, we were very happy. Let's say, at least I was.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm very encouraged by I'm noticing a change in the scientific community in terms of the willingness to talk with me. Physicists of many different. I mean, I'm having some interviews even with a few pretty top names in physics. Just I think that what everyone is noticing is that whereas before they were able to just ignore people like Sabine or Eric and just look at it as just, oh, this is completely inconsequential. They're not participants in our community. They have no bearing on the community. That actually the way that their rhetoric polarizes the public against science brings in political parties that do affect you, that do affect your ability to get funding to do the science that you're doing. So it's time for all of us to get together and speak out. And I just have really enjoyed being able to platform physicists so that everyone can hear what physicists really do and what they think of these kinds of figures like Sabine and Eric, because it's time for people to know, right? If you and it's also very important for me because that I'm not a physicist, people will retreat to that, oh, Sabine is a physicist and you're not. Well, She kind of is, but
Eh,
let's talk to physicists that are much, much more accomplished than she ever
yeah.
was. And then you're going to have to default to what they say because that's your way of gauging the veracity of what us figures are saying. So, um,
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I try to put some references in the presentation and so on to show that what I'm saying is not just made up, right? Um, so yeah, the credibility can come from many sources, and we are all, or at least most of us, are very happy to have a dialogue. But that kind of rhetoric is the opposite of a dialogue,
yeah,
right? It completely closes off any legitimacy for curiosity about how the world works, to closing the gaps in our understanding in an extremely natural and methodologically sound way. Like none of that. It's all bullshit. It's all it's all the same. Like it's ridiculous.
yeah.
Way over
Hence
the line.
my more recent conclusions that this is actual literal paid propaganda coming from her. So whether or not you guys want to dive into all that, yeah, that's my conclusion that I've come to. But yeah, you had some kind of an anecdote I think about Sabina?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I will not. I mean, let's say when I was doing my PhD, right? Uh, So I was working on, let's say, strings without supersymmetry, right? Like how to make string theory work without supersymmetry.
Hmm.
And there was a PhD buddy of mine doing his PhD at the same time, right? And he was working more on like cosmology kind of stuff, sort of maybe somewhat inspired from string theory, but not really string theoretic per se. And he sort of got interested in dark matter and alternatives thereof, like stuff like modified gravity theories, and he noticed that there were some works, including the literature includes some work by Sabine, and he was like, oh, let's study these models, right? And so he our advisor went in with in that line of work a little bit, but mostly, I mean, I think mostly was him really working by himself as a PhD student, and he was like, wait a second, but like this theory is not causal. Like it has superluminal propagation and this and that. And I was like, so maybe as I said, like it's extremely. And then of course he ended up publishing the paper. Okay, that sort of, I mean, to my understanding, shows that that work was at the very least inconsistent with very basic physical principles.
Yeah.
From like during a PhD. So yeah. And yeah,
There's just her new career of just crapping on her intellectual superiors. It just reeks of sour grapes that have turned into something more nefarious, I think.
yeah, it sort of this was my feeling as well, right? Because as I said, I sort of knew of her and similar personalities. I mean, she's not the only one by all means, but
Mhm.
she's certainly the most prominent one now, who went like on a similar trajectory, and like such a like aggressive critique of like what we do, coming from a place where like you're just willing to give up like basic principles of physics
Yeah.
have been thoroughly tested and well established theoretically and experimentally. Like that kind of seems like a very wild double standard.
Yeah. Yeah, for someone who has never made any significant contribution to the field.
Indeed. Like as I said, in the actual community, like these names do not even appear as a whisper.
Right.
Um,
No whispers, which is why they're now shouting all over the internet and trying to assert themselves over the entire physics community.
yeah, there is someone said at some point, I don't remember who, if you lose the battle on the grounds of like, scientific research, you can wage war on the internet or
Yeah,
similar
you
platforms.
can
And
yeah, you can just turn your back on science and become yeah. You well, it's this has been a long time coming and I'm really glad to see the physics community punching back. Uh
I'm extremely happy that you're like collecting contributions.
yes.
Like that really means a lot, and
Yeah.
it's important to push back. I think it's
These are the two
definitely
things that I can do. I can spell out the agenda in my own words with as much clarity as possible, but then to go along with that, I need to platform voices within the physics community. You guys, people need to hear what you have to say. So thank you for speaking up.
Well, and thank you for having me. It was yeah.
Thanks, Ivano. And finally, let's wrap things up with another heavy hitter, Nicholas Warner, professor of physics and astronomy at USC. To say that Nick is influential would be an understatement. Take it from Sean Carroll, who wrote a blog post called Best Class Ever to describe Nick Warner's general relativity course at MIT, which he used to attend despite not being formally enrolled. Beyond Nick's gift for explaining complex physics concepts, he has a lot to say about professional trolls like Sabine, so let's hear it from him.
Nick, thanks so much for joining me here. I'm excited to talk to you a bit. Why don't we start? Just give us the quick summary of what you do, what your research is about.
Well, I'm an unrepentant string theorist, but I particularly use string theory to understand the quantum structure of black holes, because I think that's the one place where ultimately we might actually have the best shot of testing these ideas. But most particularly, there's a big unsolved problem in black hole physics, which is known as the information paradox, talking about what happens to all the stuff that goes into a black hole and how it comes back out, or the information about it comes back out in Hawking radiation. And I'm trying to solve that problem within the framework of string theory. And we have some pretty, compelling answers. A lot of people are trying to solve this problem from different perspectives. And so there's a very interesting sort of symbiosis across the community, all centered around trying to figure out what quantum black holes look like. And that's what I do as much as I can. But also, with string theory, there are always spin-off technologies, and so therefore I also pursue some of those threads as well.
That's I enjoy the phrase unrepentant string theorist. That's fun, and perhaps necessary, because I mean, my follow-up is that Sabine and also Eric Weinstein are constantly railing against string theory. She, in her last video, said, "How is it even defined?" She threw her arms up, so perplexed. What even is string theory? It doesn't make any predictions. This is a waste of money. Eric says all of the money is being sucked up by string theory. Is that even true? What is your response to all of this rhetoric, this anti-string theory rhetoric?
Wow, that's a huge can of worms, and we should dissect that on many levels. So maybe I should sort of start off by sort of saying why I do string theory, and then we can evolve into the criticisms that might be thrown my way. There's something about doing fundamental science that's just, a joyful experience. It's fantastic to understand things, even things that I haven't discovered myself, but I could admire that other people have discovered. It just brings a lightness. You go, oh my God, isn't that neat? There's a sort of enthusiasm, a sense of wonder that it keeps renewing. And string theory is, every time I look at a physics problem from that perspective, I've found a new way to look at that problem, most particularly with black holes. And so there's a sort of joy of the discovery. Then there's the sort of process by which you present it to others. And sometimes, the others, my colleagues, maybe don't like what I've done, but there's a sort of process of peer review. And that usually, if your idea is good enough, makes your work better. And so eventually, if you've done your work well enough, it starts getting built into the infrastructure of science. And, I'm not Newton or anything like that, but this phrase that Newton said in his letter to Robert Hooke in 1675, he said, the reason why I've seen that much further is because I stood on the shoulders of giants. There's a really important part to science, which is when you develop a scientific idea, you have to connect it back to the work of others. And you have to then, in some sense, make it accessible for your peers to understand it, review it, and perhaps build it into the structure itself. Now, I've known of Sabine critiques for many years, and Eric Weinstein, actually, I never heard of until I heard about the Piers Morgan interview with Sean Carroll, and I watched this guy. He is sort of somebody who, his paper, I pulled it in, out of curiosity, I pulled in his paper and started looking at it. And here's a guy who's completely disconnected from science. He has 12 citations at the end of the paper, but he doesn't seem to cite the citations actually in the paper. At the beginning of the paper, he says this work is for entertainment purposes only, and you can't build on it. And for me, that is so deeply antithetical to the spirit of science. I want people to build on my work because if it's good, it will make a foundation for something even better. So when you start your paper off saying you can't build on this, this is not allowed, this is entertainment purposes only, it already sends up about 6 red flags. So then I checked on Eric. He did his PhD with Raoul Bott in mathematics in 1992 at the University of Harvard. As far as I can tell, he's been some kind of hedge fund relationship ever since. He has, on this INSPIRED database, which is the sort of gold standard of particle physics, he has one paper, which is his PhD thesis, which was written in 1992, and it has exactly 0 citations. So here's a guy who seems to be completely disconnected from the world that I know, and perhaps from the world of particle physics. But he's making pronouncements. I mean, his paper is 69 pages of mathematical diagrams, but not terribly coherent. It's incomprehensible in the sort of, how to put it, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't parse in sense. Now, I'm sure he would say, well, I'm just too ignorant to understand it, but
I'm sure he would. Maybe not to your face, but yeah.
Oh, no, I'm happy to say this in my face. We can have a debate about it. But the point is that you have to make the effort to get the community you're trying to interest in a subject to actually read it and try and connect it to what they're doing and use that as perhaps the connective tissue to build upon. But we're not allowed to build on it. And moreover, he doesn't seem to care about it. He also calls it a work in progress. It's 2021. It's the only paper there is. So I'm sorry. I look at Eric Weinstein much like I look at flat earthers. Flat earthers build this entirely separate society. They have their own conferences. They have their own universe in which they operate, and they talk to each other. But wow, have they got some misconceptions? And so this is one of the problems of the sort of this sort of field, that they're able to disconnect themselves from the sort of establishment, or more precisely the foundational science that we learn in graduate school, and just write some stuff that they expect everybody to bow down and think they're a genius, and the stuff just doesn't make sense.
Well, I think you comparing Eric Weinstein to flat earthers is going to be the highlight of this entire video. That's very enjoyable. But I mean, I think that really elucidates the whole point here, is that Eric doesn't want you to read it. He operates in such a way that he's trying to avoid scrutiny from the academic community so that he can continue going on podcasts and pretending that he has this incredible work, when he knows that anyone knowledgeable is going to very easily tear it apart. But I mean, to get back to Sabine, though, Sabine is credentialed. She much more than Eric knows what she's talking about. So when she levies these accusations, string theory is not well defined, where are the predictions, what is the point of any of this? How can we respond to her here? Because she's not Eric Weinstein. She should know better.
Okay, so there are many people who are critical of string theory on many levels, and some of them come to criticize it in a way that actually makes the field better and stronger. So Sabine is a very complex person. I've watched quite a number of her videos, some of them on just science. I watched one recently on the Andromeda paradox, and it's just nice science, nicely explained. She is a good storyteller. But sometimes the stories she wants to tell are driven by a desire to tear things down rather than build things up, I think. So, there are 2 ways you can get to prominence in pretty much any field. One of which is you work within the existing structures and you do things bigger and better and more exciting, and you build upon that. It's the shoulders of giants thing. But the other way you can get to prominence is you trample everybody else down. You drag them down to your level. And so, again, going back to Eric Weinstein, watching him on the video, he was with Sean, and his entire shtick was to drag or try and pull Sean down to his level and make equivalences between him and Sean. And to some extent, Sabina's tearing down of not just string theory, she's talking about now all of science funding as wasted money.
Yes.
I mean, the easiest argument for a general audience about what science funding is all about is it's like a form of venture capitalism. Actually, it pays off better than venture capitalism. You throw a pile of money at a lot of smart people with interesting and possibly exciting ideas, and some of them are going to pay off, and some of them are going to pay off extremely highly, and some of them are just going to be gone or waste. If you look at in the old days, you'd go to the library, you could see the shelves occupied by physical review A and B and C. C is the biggest condensed matter sort of area. And a year's worth is a few feet long, a couple of feet long. And you know that 90% of that is just not going to be interesting 10 years from now. Maybe 95%. But the 5% is going to turn into something remarkable, something interesting, and the 1% will turn into something remarkable. And the same is true with science funding. And I think the agencies, the agencies like NIH, DOE, and National Science Foundation, that's the model they operate on. They know that the stuff they fund, some of it is not going to ultimately pay off. And some of it is just going to make amazing breakthroughs and change the way we think and live. So getting back to Sabine, she says things about string theory that simply aren't true. For example, one of the things that string theory did as a spin-off technology was the discussion of the viscosity to entropy ratio of a quark-gluon plasma. String theory was exactly the one piece of physics that got that number right, that was measured in Brookhaven. Now, it's a spin-off technology. But why do we do string theory? We don't have a viable theory of quantum gravity except possibly for string theory. And string theory, so let me back it out. When I was a graduate student 40 odd years ago, the problem of quantum gravity was considered one of the deep, difficult theoretical problems. People have been trying to do this since the 1950s and failing utterly for very, very good reasons. Sean mentioned one of them, which is that the trouble with gravity is it couples to everything. And in fact, in the Piers Morgan interview, I think Sean gives a very good summary of why people got excited about it in the 80s. I got excited about string theory in the 80s. The first step in that thing was an area called supergravity. It was invented, sort of co-invented with string theory. And I got involved in that because it was an extended theory of gravity that seemed to do better in the quantum regime than ordinary gravity. But it wasn't good enough. We still found problems in supergravity, and supergravity is part of string theory, and string theory seemed to pass those tests, these infinite answers to reasonable physical questions that you find in gravity or quantum theories of gravity. So string theory is this theory of quantum gravity. It's passed all the tests. We don't have a definitive proof that it is a quantum theory of gravity, but it's come pretty close from the point of view of physicists. And now there's this other problem with black holes. Maybe it's a good historical analogy. I like to use in this context. 1912, Rutherford scatters alpha particles off gold atoms, and he figures out the structure of the atom. And the Rutherford atom becomes the model of matter. But there was this little problem, these details having to do with atomic spectra. And the Rutherford atom just predicted that the atom would, if you apply principles of electromagnetism to it, the electrons would decay into the nucleus and create continuous radiation. But spectral lines are very sharply defined emission lines. And to understand those, you need quantum mechanics. And so in 1912, we pretty much thought we had a good model of matter, except for these annoying details having to do with atomic spectra. And then once you figured out what those annoying details were telling you, you had to invent quantum mechanics. And I tend to look at black hole physics in the same way. We have an amazing theory of black hole physics, which is general relativity theory. It's good enough for LIGO. In fact, LIGO's tested the hell out of it. But it causes a problem when it comes to quantum black holes. You get this information problem, which simply says you chuck suppose you make a black hole out of politicians, you make a black hole out of hydrogen gas, you make a black hole out of rocks. They all look the same. If they all have the same mass, they radiate Hawking radiation exactly the same way. Now, the thing is that general relativity theory produces these things called uniqueness theorems, which say that from outside, the structure of a black hole is unique. And the important point is Hawking radiation originates just outside the horizon. So therefore, it knows nothing about what's inside the horizon and creates a radiation pattern that's identical for every black hole you make. And so the black holes all evaporate in the same way, turning into a cloud of Hawking radiation. And you cannot reconstruct what the black hole was made out of from that radiation. That violates core principles of quantum mechanics. There's a determinism in quantum mechanics that says you have to be able to do that. So 1980 or so, Hawking pointed to this incredible problem with the black hole radiation and the information paradox, and we've been trying to solve it ever since. String theory is one of the few places where there has been serious progress in addressing that problem. And that's what makes it so exciting to me. It's an amazing thing. Mm-hmm. And it uses all the spin-off technologies of string theory. Even Sabine talks about holographic field theory or ADS-CFT. It's an amazing spin-off technology, but I use that technique to study the structure of what's inside a black hole. So string theory is alive and well and addressing core problems. It is not this sort of central focus of every hiring initiative anymore. It has reached an equilibrium. And there are many things like that go through boom and bust phases. And we're looking at the AI revolution at the moment. We've had previous revolutions where people wanted to hire all sorts of 1990s neural nets are a big thing. It's now AI. It's now because of
I really like the example you gave about Rutherford. The history of atomic theory in general is my favorite example of how good science is always iterative. And we went from Dalton's model to J.J. Thomson's plum pudding, and then Rutherford, and then the Bohr model, and then Schrodinger came along. And I don't have a deep understanding of theoretical physics, but it's my impression that you guys are operating in pretty much that way. And so the same way that Rutherford's model or Bohr's model wasn't wrong, it just was limited, and then we were able to expand when we understood quantum mechanics. All of these things you guys are doing, right? Everyone is, as you said, shoulders of giants. You're all doing your part, and you're expanding what we understand. So that's what really irritates me the most when I hear Sabine say things like, "Oh, geometric unity sucks," but guess what? All of the physics sucks. Just as much as that. Okay. It boils my blood, and I'm not even part of your community. So, yeah.
Got one other analogy, and then I'll address the point. There's a thing in fluid dynamics called the Navier-Stokes equation. My father was an aerodynamicist in the early part of his life, and so I was raised on sort of Navier-Stokes flow. It's an equation that describes fluid flow with turbulence and viscosity. It's an amazing equation. It has got some beautiful structure to it. But if you really want to understand what's going on at a fundamental level, you need the atomic theory of matter. So Navier-Stokes is kind of like general relativity theory. General relativity theory and Navier-Stokes are effective theories of what really is going on at a fundamental level. That's what we now believe. General relativity theory isn't a fundamental theory in its own right. There is a more fundamental theory which reveals, if you like, the atomic structure of black holes, but not atomic. It's whatever the structure of black holes is. So Navier-Stokes is fantastic. It's a beautiful mathematical equation with incredibly mathematically interesting solutions, and it describes fluid flow. But if you want to understand ionization across a shock edge and a re-entry vehicle, you can't use Navier-Stokes. You need to go beyond. Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting to the point of dragging things down, it's an easy thing to do, and it's also a very destructive thing to do. You see it all over the place, all over the political world, even in the press, that basically you try and reduce everybody's opinion to equivalency. So, I go out and somebody says, I've got evidence the Earth is flat. They get a scientist who says, no, the Earth is round. And then they get another equal time person to talk about the Earth being flat. There is a tendency to want to drag things down, to make problems that are complex and nuanced into very, very simple problems that any person can therefore see the error of the ways of universities or of scientists or whatever else. So the tragedy is that, in some sense, Sabine is trying to make everybody's opinion equal. Now, everybody's opinion being equal on many things is the right way to go when it comes to elections. When you vote for somebody, everybody's opinion is important. But if it comes to whether the Earth is flat, or whether there's global climate change, or whether there is structure to the horizon scale of a black hole, not everybody's opinion is equal. You have to have spent a lot of time studying these problems to have a valuable view on these things. And so, but Sabine's approach is to just say, well, this is all nonsense and that is all nonsense, and anybody can see that this is true. It's appealing to the lowest common denominator of the everyman or every person. And it's very, very appealing. But it also appeals to this deep distrust that people have of elites and authorities. And to some extent, it's perhaps self-serving of me to say, but in the sense of some people opinions should be trusted over others. I mean, if you take the chairman of the Fed, I want somebody with that kind of education determining what the interest rates are, not maybe an astrologer. I mean, not everybody's opinion is equal, but Sabine drags every scientific question down to this lowest common denominator, tramples the ground all around it, makes everybody look small. And the other thing that, for me, that distresses it, is there's no joy in it. Or maybe if they'd be pathological if there were. The point about scientific discovery is the sense of wonder that it creates in the discoverer, and the sense of wonder that it creates in the audience who listens to it. This is, Sean or Brian Greene or Phil Halper, that they're wonderful purveyors of science because they're trusted by the scientists. They get the science largely right. In Sean's and Brian's case, they are scientists. And yet they also convey the sense of wonder and beauty and excitement from the field. When I listen to Sabine videos, the ones that aren't scientific, the sociological videos about how we should defund science or science is communism, I'm just left with this feeling of ick. It's like, oh dear, I've just descended into the muck. And I've lost the sense of wonder. For me to do research, I have to be excited about what I'm doing. I have to really, because I'm going to spend hours doing a single calculation or days doing a single calculation. There has to be a sense of excitement and enterprise to drive that, because it's bloody hard work.
Well, I think that the joy and the excitement from the perspective of her and her science illiterate viewers is this manufactured schadenfreude of pretending that the work of brilliant scientists is actually failure and is actually nothing, and they don't have to be threatened by the. I mean, to me, like, I understand distrust of governing authority, authoritative bodies. But to put intellectual authority on that level, just someone who's intelligent and decided to study a thing, and so they know about it, to be threatened by that is an extreme character flaw. But yeah, I don't know. I think the only other question I really have is, I think we've talked about this because we're sort of elucidating some aspects of this rhetoric, but do you have any other tips for people that need help discerning between a trusted voice in science versus a snake oil salesman?
Ah, wow. You see, it's complicated. Other ways to tell. I mean, I would tend to look at the fellow travelers. So look at the universe in which they operate. So, for example, Sean, he still writes papers by himself or with other scientists. Brian is the same. Or Phil, who was not a career scientist, but he talks to many, many scientists. Roger Penrose, I've done a couple of videos, Daesh, Afshordi. There are people. So if you look at the fellow travelers, who are they? Who are the people who are talking to this person? And if it's a closed ecosystem like the Flat Earth Society, then you should really question who you're listening to. But if it's an open ecosystem where good scientists are coming in, good scientists, you can look them up on the Inspired database or Google Scholar and see whether these are reasonable scientists. And then the other thing also, one of the things I really liked about Sean's thing with Piers Morgan was not only to have this sense of excitement. When Piers asked that sort of rather, I won't go there, but just a somewhat lame question about God and before the Big Bang, Sean lit up. And he lit up because he's about to interview Naisha Shorty and Phil Halper about what might have happened before the Big Bang. And he lit up because he was taking joy in the fact there's an idea. It's an interesting idea, and he's about to have a conversation and record a conversation with some people who've just written a book about it. It's a very nice, but it's how to put it. The thing that matters is, are they growing the world? Are they making it a better place? I mean, is there a sense
That's the
of
thing.
fun?
You guys are all, you guys are all just part of the establishment. That's the problem.
Yes.
Sabina
Right.
is the brave truth teller, the
Yes.
whistleblower on the outside, and
Yep.
she's not let into your circle. And Eric especially is not let into your circle because they can't handle their super hot truth, right? Isn't there something to that narrative?
Yeah, but flat earthers say the same thing. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so there is this, there is this pathology which humans exhibit, which is I have discovered this secret that it's conspiracy theories. Well, I've
Mhm.
discovered this secret that the government is not letting us, and there's been this active suppression. You know, the fact that we went to the moon or not. Well, I've discovered it was all done in a studio here, there, and everywhere. I mean,
Mhm.
the point is there's a tendency to find secrets, or think that these secrets are being kept in this massive government conspiracy. People build these universes in which they live, and social media doesn't really help that process. In fact,
Yeah.
quite the opposite. It creates these
Yes.
separate ecosystems. So,
And there are
so,
these
so,
figures that take advantage of this pathology in
right.
the community and in the public and tell them exactly what they want to hear.
Well, the algorithms of Facebook are notorious for that fact. But I was going to say it's also, how to put it. Sabine, the thing about Sabine is she's complicated because she has done some good science videos. She was a scientist, um, and yet she's decided to go down this route of tearing the edifice down. And I would like, if there's a better edifice to be built, then go out and build it or start building it. But don't go around tearing down the edifice that actually works, the edifice that provides you with electricity and power and modern medicine. That don't tear those edifices down until you've got something better. Because I tell you, if you get something better, you're going to have a flood of people. A really good example of this is graduate students. Now, graduate students are people who have been trained through undergraduate and then graduate school, and they're looking to work on some really cool piece of science. And they're very, very smart people, and they have been trained in the basics. They're on the shoulders of the giants, if you like. And now they're looking for something to do. And if you come along with a really exciting new idea and they look at it going, yeah, that's cool, and it seems to make sense, you're going to get that graduate student to want to work with you. So that's a really good barometer. And if I go into a science department or physics department and I want to know who's good and who's not so good or who's gone, whatever, I talk to the graduate students because they know exactly where the bodies are buried and they know exactly who's doing cool and interesting stuff. Now, graduate students are also not stupid. They also want to get a job afterwards. So sometimes the choices are driven by, well, I'm going to do quantum information because it's the hot topic now, or I'm going to do string theory because it was the hot topic 30 years ago. But I would say, look where the graduate students are moving. Look at what they're doing. That's a very, very good barometer of a physics department, a chemistry department, because those are extremely highly informed people who are looking to see where their career is going to go, and they're going to make the best possible judgment they can for their future. And generally speaking, that's a very good barometer. So Eric Weinstein or Sabine, do they have graduate students?
Of course not. They're not in academia.
Well, I know, but the point is, if they were directing projects for would-be students, then maybe I'd be more sympathetic. But
No, they both know the inescapable logic of what you're saying, that science has built something and you're not. So if you're tearing this down without having something better, and you know that you're not offering something better, then we have to start questioning the motives for the rhetoric. But
so I don't see anything better, but it's also how to put it? There's too much of a tendency in society at the moment to try to sort of tear things down, make everybody's opinion equivalent, and then dump on the establishment and the elites. And okay, the elites, the establishment, can abuse their power, but I'm not saying they have or will, and they should be brought up in let's take another example from science. Peer review. Peer review actually works. It's kind of like juries. I mean, there are mistakes made, but peer review of scientists is pretty much like juries trying a case. I've sat on a couple of juries when I became citizen 20 years ago. They work. They're very imperfect, but they work. They come to a judgment that is actually usually the right one and for the right reason. And so in science, we have peer review. Sometimes it's partisan. When I submit a proposal to the Department of Energy, 1 out of 5 reviews can be snarky or actually just say this is rubbish, and then you have to address that. But on the whole, the peer review system gets it right. I've sat on panels in DOE in Washington, and there are 20 people sitting around a room looking at the reviews that have been written and trying to make judgments as to who are the funding priorities. The system is imperfect, but works. And having participated in it, I have faith that it works. I see mistakes, I see errors, but they are the outliers. 90% of the time, it lands exactly what it should do.
Imperfect, but the best we've got, and yeah, does not need to be torn down. I think that's the best way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of it's as I say, for the more general person, maybe they participated in a jury trial. And from my experience of participation in that was to realize that the system worked. It did, I'm sure there were outliers, but it's the same deal. There are systems, it reminds me of what is the famous quote of Churchill, democracy is a terrible form of government, except for all the other ones that have been tried from time to time, I think I've misquoted it, but that's roughly what he said.
Yes, democracy is the best form of government, except for all the other ones, I think is the quote.
That's right.
But no, it's absolutely right. Not that I'm a huge fan of Churchill, but I mean, I think that it's a good, this idea that this imperfect but functional system has to be torn down and replaced with the whimsy of propaganda peddlers at the behest of whomever.
The other question I have about this whole thing is, there's a financial model behind being online and having blogs and so forth, and so when I watch Sabine, Sabine, I think, is she aiming to please somebody? Who's paying for this? There is this term trolling for something. Now, trolling has many meanings, not the Norwegian monster I'm thinking of, but I'm thinking of the way you fish, where you take a baited line, you drag it behind a boat, hoping that things are going to bite on it, or trolling in the sense of the internet, where you say something outrageous. A lot of her negativity, I think, is just simply to drive clicks, and that gives her currency in literal and physical sense. And so I find that disturbing. I mean, there are people who actually out there who do things just because they love doing it. Phil Halper's a case in point. I just discovered another colleague of mine, a French colleague. He has a physics YouTube presence, and some of his YouTube videos are 3 hours long in French, and they have 1 million viewers.
That's astounding.
And all he's doing, he told me what he was doing. He basically he gets his iPad, and he starts with a very simple statement of the problem, and then he solves it completely and slowly in front of you for 2 or 3 hours. This is a sort of thing which is immensely valuable, and obviously people, French students, it's in French. But it's there are amazing people out there who do really cool things. And as I say, Sabine has done some really nice basic science videos, but the ones that are obviously driving the clicks are the ones where she tries to tear, all these really creative people trying to do really interesting things and engage the sense of wonder in themselves and in their colleagues and in the population. And it's just being trampled on. And maybe she thinks that's the right thing, but
yeah, my viewers obviously know that I am in full agreement and have been saying this for quite some time. But at any rate, I appreciate the additional perspective from figures such as yourself, specifically on Sabine and Eric Weinstein and these people, but also, we love to hear from you and the enthusiasm that you have for your work and what it actually looks like inside the physics community or academia in general, what you guys really think about and what you're really trying to do. And that is just as valuable, I think, as addressing the science deniers. So thank you for both of those things.
Thanks, Nick. And there you have it. 6 physicists, arguably all of whom are more accomplished than Sabine, but at the very least, 2 of them considerably so. If you were someone who held her on a pedestal because of her profound physics knowledge or degree status, your excuse has now completely evaporated, unless you're intellectually bankrupt enough to whine about how they must all be part of the establishment, defending their grift for grant money. That would be quite predictable. Dave must be wrong because he's not a physicist, so he can't possibly debunk Sabine the real physicist, but all these physicists who are way more knowledgeable and relevant than Sabine must also be wrong, because scientists are actually lying jerks. Am I about right, fellas? To hypocritical morons who are this far gone, I can only show you that you've built around yourself an impenetrable fortress of defense against reality. You've compromised any shred of intellectual integrity you may ever have possessed, deflecting all the slings and arrows that threaten your delusional worldview with whatever ad hoc reasoning is required, whether it's someone having not enough credentials or too many. You are completely captured by anti-intellectual propaganda, and nothing will change until you take it upon yourself to get your life together. It is not the case that every physicist in the world is a lying fraud and Sabine is the lone truth teller. It is the case that physicists are busy doing physics and Sabine is the lone lying fraud tearing the whole thing down from the outside. Well, not lone, there's Eric too. But anyway, it's time to face reality, Sabine fanboys. You bet on the wrong horse. Cut your losses and pick a new hobby. I suggest actually learning physics. Sadly, not everyone has gotten the memo that Sabine is a fraud. Alex O'Connor recently had her on his podcast. Alex doesn't strike me as the type to cater to fascist propaganda, so I'll give him a pass and assume that he just doesn't know much about her. And Sabine, like any successful fraud, knows exactly how much of her hand to play in a venue like this. She'll depart from her propaganda to try and appear neutral and hide the grift whenever appropriate. But she can't keep it up indefinitely. Here's a telling moment towards the end.
Unless you can actually write it down and make a prediction with it, I'm not having it.
You're not having it if it doesn't make a prediction, huh? What are the predictions made by geometric unity, Sabine? You'll go to bat for that without any predictions, and then you'll disparage string theory despite all the predictions, even the successful ones, as we've highlighted previously. Pretty transparent. Want another funny tidbit? Take a look at this. What I learned as a hired consultant to autodidact physicists. I doubt she still does it since she's raking in the dough these days, but Sabine used to charge physics crackpots $50 per 20 minutes to consult about their pointless attempts at creating a theory of everything. All those delusional dudes with zero physics education who have convinced themselves they're the next Einstein, Sabine will take your money. And yes, she's serious. Look how serious she says she is. Here's an interview where she's talking about the same thing. Consultant for armchair physicists. Sabine, why are there so many crackpots? Is academia to blame? You blame academia for everything, so surely academia is to blame, right? Oh, it's not? The problem is with science communicators like you, who constantly tell the public that working scientists are idiot frauds whose entire body of work is total bullshit, leaving the door wide open for uneducated morons to delude themselves into thinking they have something to contribute? Funny how that works, huh? Maybe you should stop crapping on the people who have gotten the education you're pretending to value. And the greatest irony of all this, Sabine loves to play both sides. Money-hungry, exploitative Sabine loves to rip off misguided idiots for a paycheck, but German pop star Sabine sings a totally different tune.
All you guys with theories of everything, oh, follow me wherever I'm traveling. Your theories are neat, I hope they will succeed, but please don't send them to me.
Don't send them to you, huh? At least not without paying up first. Cool 1980s elementary school picture day backdrop, by the way. Speaking of theories of everything, does geometric unity make a little cameo in this cringy screech fest?
Geometric unity is what he calls his theory, and not ideally he thinks really everybody needs to hear it. What's it good for at last? I've been told I'm not supposed to ask.
Not supposed to ask, huh? Then why did you make a video bending over backwards to scold everyone for mocking his dumb theory? This song was posted in 2020, so we can be confident that Peter Thiel got to you after this. Thanks for helping us construct the timeline of you selling out to fascist oligarchs. Anyway, that was just a little cherry on top to contrast with the serious conversations with real physicists. If you are someone who continues to hold Sabine up on a pedestal because you believe she's some amazing physics genius, just like Eric, but you refuse to engage with what these 6 physicists are saying, then you're a brainwashed hypocrite. You don't give 2 shits about physics. You only care about the anti-establishment narrative that makes you feel smart and special. Once again, by any metric imaginable, at the absolute least, Michael Peskin and Nick Warner are dramatically more accomplished, more knowledgeable, more influential, and more relevant to the progress of physics than Sabine. Although I would wholeheartedly argue that this is the case for all 6 of them. Anyone who actually cares about physics must inevitably conclude that far from being the lone truth-teller in a sea of corruption, Sabine is a bitter narcissist who deceptively tears down the whole field for profit, whether we are talking about AdSense revenue or teal bucks. For anyone who still can't see that, there is no hope for you. So that's it for Sabine Hossenfelder. Again, she's quickly become my new James Tour, as you can see. Once well respected, now universally understood to be a complete fraud. I wonder if she'll keep up the childish tantrums long enough to self-destruct as magnificently as he has. Until next time.